I'm back. This is live. You're here with me live. All right. So there's so much stuff that's happening right now. I'm afraid I'm going to forget some of the things I got to talk about. Okay. So welcome for being here. I'm glad you're here. Welcome to the show. My name is Bret. This is live. I do this live now over 4 years, maybe even 5. I think it was 2018. I'll look up the original date some other day, but we just had the 200th show. Talked about a lot of the tools. Not all my demos went perfectly because I didn't plan properly, but that's life. And I feel off my game lately. This has been a rough month. If you're on my newsletter, check it below. There's a newsletter link. You can also get that up there. But I just got over the flu. It was a pretty good one. I rarely get the flu, and that was a pretty good stint where I took some days off. Working for yourself, you don't take a lot of days off. That's actually part of the negative part of working for yourself is you never stop working. And then I got COVID last week. COVID for the second time. Luckily, I seem to be on the mend. I am going to be at CIVO Navigate speaking and workshopping next week, and I'm making it all this week during COVID because I couldn't make up more time, so I had to do it. So I'm a little bit off my game today. You might hear me mute in order to blow my nose or something. I have headphones on because I'm lazy today, so yeah. Also, I have a couple of friends out there that are also going through some tough times, and I want to just say I'm sorry for you and your loss. And if you're on Twitter and you're in that CNCF community, there's stuff happening lately with other people. Just people have life stuff going on. So I feel like I need a big group hug. Can we all group hug on the internet and just say it's all going to be okay? Okay. So, and I got this new shirt from Traffic. So thank you, Tiffany, and the rest of the gang at Traffic. I got a nice little cool contributor t-shirt from Traffic. I can't really see that one. That came in the mail this week while I was sick watching TV, as I do when I'm like napping and sleeping and eating things you shouldn't. That's what you're supposed to do when you're sick, right? So, yeah. All right, so I'm going to be in Tampa. DevOps Toolkit's going to be there. Victor. There's a whole bunch of people going to be there next week. I'm excited. It's almost like a mini reunion of a lot of us cloud native types that like to talk about cloud native. The CIVO gang has done a really great job, I think, in pulling in a lot of the, at least big guns to me, like people that are, I've never got to see Steve Wozniak speak, so I'm going to get to see that. That's going to be pretty exciting. Luckily, I'll be on my 10th day of post-COVID, you're allowed to be in public, and I'll still be wearing a mask as I do. But luckily, I will still be able to be there. So we're driving down this weekend. Actually going to drive to Florida from Virginia. And if you're able to be there, I can't wait. Let me know in the chat if you're going to be there. It's an East Coast, brand new U.S. East Coast conference. I know a lot of you don't live in the U.S., and that's okay. You've got your own great conferences. We don't get a lot of great East Coast conferences. Usually we have some in Washington, D.C., which are military or government-oriented. Sometimes we get regional small conferences. We have a couple of great ones in Raleigh that also is helped with by some other Docker captains, Nirmal, if you're out there, like the DevOps Days and Everything Open conferences in Raleigh. So we have some great stuff. We're actually getting ready to start working on our conference locally that we used to have, 300-400 people, and we're going to get back to that in the real world. Our local Docker meetup and Cloud Native Kubernetes meetups all just started again last month in January for the first time since COVID. All great news, great things happening in the real world. So one of the things you can do is if you ever are able to go to conferences, I love meeting people in the community. Like it's one of my reasons I go to a conference. In fact, if you saw me at KubeCon in the fall, I was there all week. And other than the pre-conf days, which I paid extra for, and I went to the GitOps stuff, the rest of the conference, I went to one session. One. You know why? Because the videos are all on the internet. They're all there for you to watch it on your phone while you're walking a dog or whatever. The reason I'm there is community. So I hang out in the expo hall. I meet up with friends. I make new friends. That's how it all started, was making new friends. Like Victor and other people on the show. Yeah. Yeah, like Jason and a lot of these other people that I happen to have met. Let's see if there's anybody else in here. But so some of you... I haven't met in the real world. So if you're going to be at a conference, I'm not at all of them, and I'm actually at less than I used to be. It's getting harder and harder to afford all the time off for conferences. But let me see if I can pull this up. So I have this page. I don't know if anybody looks at it or anybody cares, but sometimes it's just great to meet people that you've talked with on the internet, and how else do you figure that out? So I have a Find Me page. And I wish this was like we have the RSS protocol, and now we have the Fediverse protocol and Mastodon and all that. It'd be cool if we had a protocol that was decentralized that would allow you to, whether it's Mastodon or some other protocol that allows you to connect to the people you want to care about, that you can find out when they're all going to be there. And I know there's certain websites like Sketch, and there's other things where you can sort of log in, and if they all log in, and they all tell you where they're going to be. And there's been some apps around the years that have done that, but I'm going to be hopefully going to be at KubeCon. I'm actually not sure about that one yet. And then DockerCon, I do not know yet if DockerCon is going to be in the real world. By the way, we have big Docker news today, so I'm going to get to that in a minute. But anyway, if you're going to be at a conference, just go to my website /findme. And you can, if you also want to look at my back catalog of talks and whether or not they've aged well, you can find those all in there as well. I try to keep it up to date with the videos and links to the stuff you can listen to or watch or whatever. I don't go all the way back in time, but I have kind of been doing this for probably 15 years or so. So I should have started it a long time ago, like a diary, and to just sort of look at the ridiculous amount of times I've talked on the internet and in the real world. This is mostly real world stuff, but lately we've got a lot more talking on the internet stuff. And that's not even including this show, right? Which is every week. So, all right, let's get to it. I'm going to check out the chat here real quick, and then we're going to get to some crazy Docker news. Sneak peek, Docker just released their first major version today since 2020. So we're going to talk about that. I'm just all over the buttons today, so you're in for it. All right. What do we got? We had some early questions right before we went live. By the way, hi to everyone out there. I didn't get to say hi to Zalt, Benjamin, Jason, Maz, Max, Mabadel. Hopefully I pronounced that close enough. Whoopee Cushion. I think I don't know if you've been here before, but that name sounds familiar. Jason, what's up? Raj Kumar, hello everyone. All right, so there was actually some questions or some conversation before we even went live. Let's see. Sai Krishna asked, how do you run a web app in Tomcat? How to send max value to the Tomcat container? Let's see. Yeah. So Tomcat containers, any Java container nowadays, you'll want. So in the past, Java, years ago, Java wasn't good at memory management and containers. So it didn't understand C groups. So it didn't know if you were to give it a limit on the container, Java wouldn't know how to not use more than that amount of memory. So eventually a lot of Java apps would get OOM, or out of memory errors, and crash. And then the container would get restarted. And then you would have to go in and there's an option on the Java command line, well documented all over the internet. It's like XXM or something like that. And you would have to set memory limits for Java. There's other programs that we had to do this before as well back in the day. But the later releases of Java, if you're on the later releases in the last 3 years or so, at least 3-4 years, it's going to recognize any limits you set in C group. So if you're asking about that, the max values, I'm not sure. Anyway, Sai Krishna, if I'm saying that right, if you have more questions on Java, I am not the Java expert, but there are probably Java people here that can help you. If not, wait, not there. over there, DevOps fan, go to that. That's our Discord server. I know, in fact, there are some Java people in there often. So if you have very specific questions. Dan's asking, any good Kubernetes troubleshooting guides? Why is my pod in image pull backoff, for example? We're getting failed to pull image, flannel CNI, what to do? So Dan, image pull backoff, that's like one of the most common errors in Kubernetes. It just means that you can't pull your image. It might not be able to pull your image because it doesn't exist. It might not have access to that registry to pull it. The registry might be down. You might be getting a 401, a 403. You might not be authorized to get in there. Unfortunately, it's a pretty generic error. So the first step you do is you jump onto this is what I would do. The first thing I do is I jump on one of those servers, Dan, and the one that's getting the error, look at the logs, see if you can't figure out which node is trying to pull that, and you go there and you just try to pull it down yourself manually. It's not going to replace the problem because Kubernetes is still going to try to pull it. But if you go in, like the flannel CNI plugin, so you need to go into a server, maybe that's in a data center, maybe this is all like AWS security group stuff that's blocking it somehow, who knows? It may be issues with Docker Hub. I think the URL, the image name is a Docker Hub image name. So you need to get on that machine, and you have to figure out if you know your cluster. And this is why this is all more cluster operation stuff. So you have to know more about Kubernetes than the average user. And you need to go in there, and if you're using containerd, you need to use the containerd command line, which is not the Docker command line. Use the containerd command line to pull down that image and see if you can pull it. And if you can, then it might be something in Kubernetes itself. The flannel CNI image, I'm assuming, since it's a CNI plugin, is a open source image that is not authenticated, so you're not worrying about that, but it could be image pull backoff limits on Docker Hub. So you need to possibly authenticate to get more pulls, especially if you're in a data center and you are pulling from the same public IP that all the other servers are. That is, I would say, probably one of the most common problems with this. And I don't know if Kubernetes image pull backoff is smart enough to recognize the backoff limits. I don't think it is. That's my guts telling me that there might be an error message in Kubernetes logging or containerd logging, of which I don't have memorized, that would tell you. But the way to check it is to go into the server itself and try to pull. And if you can't, then you can hopefully troubleshoot. And I bet you it's something related to, if it's on Docker Hub, it's going to have a pull limit per hour, and it might just work. Like eventually it'll work because this is a rolling limit of 100 or 200 pulls per hour or something like that. You can look up on the Docker Hub documentation. If you just look at Docker Hub limits on Google, so the way to get around these is to several ways. One is to cache images in a proxy that you need to set up in your data center or in your AWS. Docker themselves even document this. You need to have a pull-through cache. It's not hard to set up, but it does need to have a lot of storage. And the goal is that once images are downloaded to your cache, they won't be re-downloaded from Docker Hub and cause you to go against your limits. The other thing is to always have all of your nodes authenticating to Docker Hub, even with a free user. A free user on Docker Hub gets twice as many, I think it's 200 per hour pulls, and then a paid user, even just a $3 or $5 a month user, you could use that on all of your Kubernetes manifests. And there's a way you can actually put it in so that it's there everywhere. You don't have to necessarily put it on every single pod spec. And if you do that, then you get unlimited pulls if you're a paid user. As far as I know, I'm pretty sure you get unlimited pulls. Someone else probably knows more, but that's the last I checked. That's a great question, Dan, and I would say probably a common one. For those of you building out large enterprise solutions, you need to worry about these pull limits, especially if your data center has a lot of servers that are all containers, or if you have a bunch of developers all going through the same VPN. You've got to worry about Docker Hub pull limits. Those are not new. They've been around at least a year and a half. And when they spring up and surprise you, they can be very frustrating. So I sympathize for you. If you use other registries right now, I'm not aware that they have pull limits. Like if you use GitHub Container Registry or the official Kubernetes registries for the Kubernetes stuff, unfortunately, with things like Flannel, you may not be able to change the URL. So you might have to pull it from Docker Hub regardless. Good question. All right. That was this question, by the way. I didn't click it up there. Yeah. All right. Hello, 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 hello. Scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. Thanks for all the love. I appreciate it. I mean, that's one of the things about working from home is you can work when you're sick. So it's both a pro and a con. Yeah, I appreciate all of you for being here. All right. What could be the best way to build a project in Kubernetes, like building an environment for microservices? Are there any repos with microservice projects that I can create a Kubernetes environment for? So the question here is, are you looking for examples? Because there are examples in my courses. Docker Samples has examples. Docker Samples has examples. That's a rhyme. So what I'm really wondering is, are you looking for coding advice or YAML advice? So generally, if you're making a microservice, the architecture, you're going to have to decide early on if you're going to create monolith repos for your apps or microservice, sort of one service per repo. A lot of people, I think, lean towards one or the other, and I feel like I tend to see more mono repos, not necessarily everything in the same repo, but maybe some related microservices all in the same repo, and then you have your own decision about where you make that delineation and you decide to make a new repository for more code. But when it comes to your Kubernetes YAML, in my mind, the way that I structure it, the way that I work with teams on structuring it, that doesn't go with your code. Your Docker file goes with your code, and maybe a compose file if you're using that locally for development. But your manifest, your Helm charts, your Kubernetes customize, your Kubernetes manifest, those go in a separate repo. And then you're going to, I like customize. I prefer customize out of the box. I only use Helm. Helm is really, to me, just for if you're going to release your software to customers, to other people, whether that's open source on the internet or it's to private businesses, or maybe you have a bunch of internal teams that will use your software and they don't know anything about it. They don't know a lot about it. So they have to have a Helm command to easily install it. Well, that's a lot of work for Helm. So I don't try to use Helm if I don't have to. I'd rather use Customize, which is very easy to understand YAML. There's no fancy templating. You know, you don't have mustache handlebars and all that stuff. It's just easy to do. So I would do that all in a separate repo, and you create your base sort of standard install YAMLs with all the pod specs in them. And then for each environment, you're probably going to create a separate directory structure. This is all, by the way, well documented in Customize's documentation, Customize with a K. And you go in there and you will make a new directory for each environment. And then you will have pull requests when you want to change an environment. And then you can decide after that, are you going to use something like Argo or Flux, or how are you going to get that YAML to your clusters? You could just, to start with, just clone the repo down your local machine and type kubectl apply. That's not what you want to do long term, but that's a little bit bigger than your question. So if that helps you at all, or if it gives you more questions, I'm just going to say Shock. Shock, that's an interesting question, but we need to dive into it to really, I think, get at the core of what your question really is. Are you just asking about GitHub structuring? And the answer there is Docker files go with code. Docker Compose can go with code or in its own repo, depending. Kubernetes YAML goes in a separate repo, as well as your GitOps, like your Argo and your Flux. That might go in the repo with your Kubernetes YAML. It also might go in a separate other repo all to its own. It doesn't really matter to me. I've seen it both ways, but that's how I do it. How much Docker must you learn before you jump into Kubernetes? At least as much as I teach in Kubernetes Mastery. The link's below to the courses, but in Kubernetes In Kubernetes Mastery, let me back this up. I have Docker Mastery and I have Kubernetes Mastery. The confusing part is that the Docker Mastery course teaches both Docker and Kubernetes. But it teaches you Docker, it teaches you how to make images, how to build images, how to make Docker files, the basics of those Docker files, what are images, how do they work, how do you make containers for them, how do you manage containers, and then you learn Compose. How do I manage multiple containers together? How do I help them talk to each other over a network? What are volumes and how do I deal with storage? How do I save things out of containers that I need to save? How do I troubleshoot the basics of containers? How do I find logs? You need to know all of that before Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is nothing more than essentially a multi-server cluster running Docker containers, or just containers. That's all it really is. It's a fancy automated solution that allows you to run 100 servers as if there's one. And so if you don't know Docker, all the things I just mentioned, and all the things I teach in Docker Mastery, then Kubernetes will frustrate you because you won't understand you'll think it's magic. You won't know what's going on, because Kubernetes networking is built upon the ideas of the basics in Docker networking. They don't use the same technical libraries, but they are built upon the same knowledge. And at the same time, you need to know Linux, because if you don't understand Linux, if you're trying to be a Kubernetes guru, if you're trying to be a Kubernetes admin, Linux and networking and kernels and virtual Ethernet interfaces and physical namespaces in the kernel, virtual namespaces in the kernel, control groups, all these concepts, you need to know those in order to really understand how Kubernetes is working at a low level. So you don't need to know all that stuff if you're just trying to use it. So if you're just trying to be a developer who's using containers day to day, that's why I made Docker Mastery. It teaches you enough Docker, enough Compose, and enough Kubernetes to be dangerous. If you want to go a little bit deeper and understand more of how Kubernetes is working, that's what Kubernetes Mastery is for. That's the next course I taught after that, and it's a little more detailed. Kubernetes Mastery assumes you know Docker and Docker networking and Linux and Compose and registries. It assumes you know all that and that you're just now learning Kubernetes. That's what Kubernetes Mastery is for. Hopefully that helps. This is a great question. Are there any, are there any GitHub repos with microservices I can create a Kubernetes environment for? Sure. I mean, there's a lot. You can just sort of Google around. And what I would do is I would go to github.com, or if you're in Google, you can type microservice example, and you can type site:/github.com. That tells Google to only return you results from github.com. So I do that, and there are a bunch of popular repos, some of which I've shown on this channel, especially the Google Cloud Platform one, which is it's to help you understand how to use GCP, but it can be used anywhere. So do that. Search microservice examples on github.com. You can look at the number of stars to tell whether or not it's a well-supported repo that a lot of people are using. So this one, the Google Microservices Online Boutique. There's also something called Sock Shop. So if you search Sock Shop, it's sort of a famous one a little bit. And it's underneath Microservices Demo Organization. So Microservices Demo, that one is another one. So look up Sock Shop Microservices. If you just want to look up Docker's examples, ones that I help maintain, by the way, that we've got a bunch of updates to recently, they're a little simpler, maybe easy to start with, and they're to help you learn Docker and Compose. But if you go to Docker samples on GitHub, you will see here the example voting app, which you've taken my courses, you've seen that one. If you've taken, I think maybe this is in my Kubernetes Mastery course. I'm trying to think about where I use it. Wordsmith is another one. Wordsmith, I think, only has, it's not really a microservice. It's just got two different parts to it. The example voting app, I wouldn't really call it a microservice. I would call it a distributed application, which could be micro, could be macro services, whatever you want to call it, monoliths. So there's those two there. And then maybe the other two that I see a lot are the Sock Shop and then the Google Cloud microservices demo. There's other ones out there as well. There's lots of them, and especially if you're a Rails developer or if you're a .NET developer, each one of your ecosystems has its own examples. There's a famous one called the To-Do app, which actually writes the same app in every front-end framework, but it's not really microservices. But if you're just interested in trying to deploy apps on containers, look up the To-Do app, To-Do example app, I think is what it's called. Yeah, To-Do MVC, there it is right there. And you can pick your front-end framework, and it's basically the almost exact same app. And what's great is that you can actually look at different front-end frameworks and compare how do you make a dynamic web application in different languages and different front ends. It's pretty cool. It's been around forever. It's been around at least 10, if not 15 years. So you can check that out. Which is the safe bet to learn? Benjamin, great question. OPA or Kyverno? So if you're just a developer or just sort of an average DevOps person and you're not specializing in Kubernetes security, like if your job isn't Kubernetes security all day long, I would say Kyverno. Kyverno is very approachable. It's actually my favorite policy engine for Kubernetes. They've been on this show. If you go back a little bit over a year, I had the founder of Kyverno on the show. We demoed it. We talked about it. And what I like about it is that it has great default templates. It doesn't require you learning a new language or a completely new set of sort of ideas around how to manage and control policy. To me, Kyverno is approachable to someone or anyone who understands how to make Kubernetes YAML. Not necessarily from scratch, but if you look at a deployment YAML and you're used to that, if you look at a pod spec, if you're used to that, then Kyverno is for you. And you can get started there pretty quickly. It's completely open source. And they have all these policies that you can sort of copy paste right out of the box for all the things you want to control in your cluster. Maybe you want to ensure that, let's look up something random here. Disallow latest tag. Maybe in production, you want to make sure that no one ever deploys the latest tag of an app because that is not a good idea in production. It's basically means it will mutate or change over time because every time you redeploy it, it'll be a new version accidentally. So you never really want to use that in production. So maybe as a cluster admin, you want to prevent anyone from ever using latest on that cluster. Maybe because that's the production cluster. Maybe in the dev cluster you allow it. And all tags are allowed by default. So what you do is you first have to install Kyverno. You have to implement that into your cluster, and they have information on how to deploy it. And then you create a new resource type. And this is copy paste. And it'll give you some comments and things in here on how to deal with it. And that's it. This is all you do. And then from then on, by default, it'll basically block people deploying pods if that container spec has a latest tag in it. Or possibly, I don't know if it's smart enough to know if there's no tag. I'm assuming that it would be, yeah. Yeah, an image, so yeah, see it's validating here and saying you have to have a tag, but if you put in latest tag, we're going to deny it, right? So this one is auditing by default, so it's not denying. Anyway, I find it very easy to understand. The templates that they have here are vast. There's hundreds of them, and they cover just about everything. We are going to talk a lot about the security of your supply chain, secure supply chain, this year. So you can look through a lot of this stuff, dropping capabilities to make sure that your application is secure by default, making sure it doesn't have net raw on the network. Um, limits and requests. Make sure that your application always has memory and CPU limits and requests. By the way, this is kind of related to my pod spec, which I talk about a lot here, but I have a standard default pod spec. It's not a replacement for Kyverno, but because Kyverno is the enforcer. It will make sure that your developers are deploying YAML that is up to your requirements. Some of the cool things about Kyverno is that it can also change things so that basically it doesn't put all the responsibility on the developer. So they can just write their YAML for their app, and then any other things like security stuff that you mandate can be added on later. It can be added on later, which I love because I don't want to saddle every developer with knowing everything they have to do about Kubernetes. So what I do here is this is a safe default. This would be the one I'd give to my team and say, this is a default pod spec. I would like this to be your template every time you make a deployment or something like that. Make sure that your pods adhere to these standards, and I have lots of comments in here, blah, blah, blah. And then I would implement Kyverno. If it was me, I would be using Kyverno in every cluster. The only question is, the closer to production, I would get more strict, right? So I might have like a dev cluster, staging cluster, prod cluster, whatever. And I would have it in all of them, but maybe just auditing in the non-production ones. Auditing meaning that it will report, but it won't prevent. And then in production, that's when I do the actual prevention of things I don't like. I'll prevent you from deploying your application unless you have resource limits. I maybe won't require a CPU limit. That's the one that we generally don't want to do. So if you go in here, you can actually see I commented out, not normally needed. Something we actually discussed a month ago on this show about whether or not to do CPU limits. The jury mostly is essentially, no, you don't need that. There's no real benefit to it, unless you're maybe a hoster of other people's apps that you don't control, and then you need to make sure they don't take over all CPUs and exhaust the resources on the cluster. But most of us aren't doing that. Most of us aren't hosting other people's stuff, right? We're the ones controlling the cluster. We and the team we work with internally are all deploying apps, so that's normal. Anyway, great questions. All right, let me get through some of this stuff. Thanks for all the questions, everyone. Thanks for that question, Benjamin. That was a great one. DeAndrews asking, they're working from an application support towards DevOps. Should Docker and Kube knowledge come before AWS solution architect? Does working on both at the same time make sense? I think that's very individual, but I think they're equally important. When you talk about like solution architect, AWS type stuff, there are hundreds of AWS offerings. I would focus on the key stuff, right? Because you can't learn all Docker before you start to learn Kubernetes. You can't learn all of AWS before you learn Docker. So I wouldn't necessarily put them in any order. I would say go with what you are interested in the moment. If you're really excited about AWS, then put the other stuff aside. Learn the basics of AWS. Learn storage. Learn security groups and networking. Learn EC2 instances and load balancers. Learn a little bit about RDS and S3. These are all the things that were big problems that AWS solved 15 years ago. It's only in the last 5-7 years that they've started to release tons of new things that very few people use. I mean, when I go to teams, the teams I work with that are all, I would say, in their first 2 or 3 years of using containers, so they're relatively new to containers, they're not particularly sophisticated on their AWS usage, which is totally fine. They maybe use a half a dozen to maybe at most 10 of the AWS services. They don't use 30 of them, right? They're not 500 developers all running a giant cloud service on AWS. So if you're like that, then learn the basics of AWS. Get one or two of those basic certs. If you're a cert person, if you're not, don't worry about it. Then go learn Docker, because as a part of learning Docker, you can then learn, how do I deploy containers on AWS? And AWS has at least 17 ways you can deploy containers. So you don't have to learn all 17, but there's a great guide by a gentleman that I'm hoping to have on the show this year. Last week in AWS. So Corey Quinn, see him on Twitter a lot if you're hanging out on Twitter. Very popular on Twitter, very snarky, fun to listen to. Has a great show every week where he, not maybe every week, I think he does a monthly YouTube video, and it's really well done. But they also have a blog, and this talks about all the ways at the time of writing, which I think was a year or two ago. Yeah, a couple years ago, year and a half ago. All the ways you can run containers. These are not all ways to run Kubernetes. These are ways to run containers. And you just scroll through there. Oh, these are more ways. Okay, so this isn't the original article. There is an original article. The original article, here we go, was almost 2 years ago. And we all hear of ones about like EKS, ECS. Those have been around a while. Those are orchestrators. But some of these, like App Runner, are becoming some of my new favorites. App Runner, to me, is the one that I try to use first. If someone says, I've got 5 or 10 containers I need to run, I try to use App Runner because it avoids the complexity of Kubernetes. Anyway, learn that stuff, then eventually learn Kubernetes after you learn Docker. That's why if you take my Docker Mastery course, you learn Docker first, because Kubernetes would not exist without Docker. Kubernetes was built on top of Docker originally. Technically still is, because Docker is Containerd. Containerd is Docker, and it runs under most Kubernetes systems. So at the end of the day, just a multi-server cluster of Docker running containers. All right, so I'm going to pause in the question. These are all great questions. Oh, I forgot to say we don't have Docker Hub. We're in a closed network. Well, Dan, yeah, that's gonna definitely be your problem with pulling the image. If you can't pull the image, and you gotta get to Docker Hub, so you got to figure that out. Got to put in a caching proxy. If you just look up on Docker's website, and you maybe have already solved this, and maybe you're talking about this later in the chat, but if you search Docker pull through proxy, every business of any decent amount of size that has more than a few Docker servers probably needs to implement this. This saves you bandwidth. This helps you in case Docker Hub goes down, and it's not that hard to set up. But on a separate machine, possibly multiple machines for redundancy, you can do something like this. Just configure a proxy server so that whenever you do a Docker pull, you have to tell all of your cluster servers and all of your devs and anyone who's pulling through that network to use a particular pull-through proxy. So it works a lot like an internet proxy, only in this case, it's caching any previous image layers that it's downloaded. It caches them on the proxy server, like a proxy cache does, and much like a web proxy, it's just storing these images in various image versions for you. So there's the setup of the proxy server, and then there's the configuration of all your servers and clients and devs so that they know to go through it. And once that happens, you can save yourself a lot of bandwidth and a lot of those Docker Hub numbers. It's also possible to do this for offline, although I would argue that you probably, for an offline setup, you need a better strategy where you're actually importing images. The setups that I typically see in that scenario are that if the data center doesn't have direct access to Docker Hub, then it's probably pulling from Harbor, a common open source registry. It's based on Docker's own registry distribution. So Harbor, there's other ones out there, but Harbor I feel like is the most popular one at this point. If you have Harbor installed, then you're going to tell your cluster to pull everything from there, and you're going to have to tag your images differently. You're going to have to make it a pull-through proxy, which Harbor supports, and you're going to want to take all your images from Docker Hub and upload them in there. And you're going to need CI automation. That basically what we would do is we had a repo that had a list of all the images we approved for use in our clusters, and our CI solution would pull those from Docker Hub, push them into Harbor, and then make them available for the cluster. So when the cluster tried to pull, it would pull from Harbor. And it would see those images because that was its cache, and it would see those images there and pull them. And of course, when there's a new version and someone didn't add that image to our list of accepted images, they would get an error in production, like you're getting, maybe related to that, and they forgot to go back in that repo, add the new tag or the new version of their app that they need into that list, and have the CI kick off the workflow of pulling it down, pushing it up, making it available for production. That's what a lot of big shops that don't allow just sort of carte blanche access to Docker Hub, that's what they do. Raj Kumar, I feel like I've talked a little bit about this already. What would be the best learning path one could to follow their foots on Kubernetes? I have courses below. I have over 500 videos. So get that stuff. And we're about to launch another one. So if you want a sneak peek and want to get on the list for a steep discount, the next one we're going to be doing is on GitHub Actions, auto deployments, and GitOps. So check out that one. And we're going to have it in March, and we're about to open it up for everyone to pay up and get in the list. We're only going to allow 10, maybe 15 people, depends on how much, some of the stuff that we're working on, whether or not we can handle 15 people. But it's very custom. It's very intimate. It's all going to be live over Zoom, small groups. It's almost going to be like private consulting. And so it's going to be more money than a cheap Udemy course, but it's going to be very targeted to a specific problem with a set of tools and how they work together. So it's going to be more complex a little bit than your typical Udemy course. And you can now get on the waiting list, and we will send you an email when we open up the registration soon. So get on that list if you're interested at all. We are going to be doing those a few times a year, and they're going to be, right now we're working on the content, and it's going to be very specific, and you're basically going to have direct access with me. And for weeks, we will spend a few hours every couple of days together, and we're going to solve this problem specifically for your workflow. So we're going to be working not just in example repos where you're going to be implementing it and learning it, but you're also going to be trying to do this on your own work, on your own projects. I'm very excited about that. So get on that notification list if you're interested at all, and we'll let you know of when the dates start opening up. All right. Great question. Does using cloud native build packs to build container images versus Docker help with reducing the image sizes? So the first thing I would argue is image size your number one problem? Probably not. Disk space is cheap. I regularly, normally with teams, deploy images that are 1 gig or 2 gigs in size. It is not a problem for them to be that big. So don't go chasing an imaginary problem. But if you are someone who's understands the correlation between increased image size and potential CVE count, because there is a correlation, it may not be direct causation, but there is a correlation between the amount of stuff you have in your image to the amount of vulnerabilities you might have in your image, then I would not look at build packs. To me, build packs are not a way to reduce CVE count. Somebody tell me if you have a different opinion. Am I right or wrong on that? But in my opinion, build packs don't do that. Build packs, to me, make it easier to make images when you don't know Docker files. But if you already know Docker files, like I teach in my courses and in my workshops, and I've been doing for years, then you don't need build packs. What you need is something like Slim AI or Docker Slim. So Slim AI is the service, and Docker Slim is the open source. Docker Slim has been around for many years. They've changed it. They call it the Slim Toolkit now. So it used to be called Docker Slim. And essentially it will look in your image and help you identify and slim up your image. You do this after the fact. You do it after you've made your images. If you're someone who's got large images today, first, make sure that you're using slim images. Are you using Python, Ruby, Node.js? Any of those all have a slim variant. I don't always recommend Alpine. In fact, I rarely recommend Alpine, simply due to the fact of its complexity and problems. It's got, I don't know, a good half dozen problems. I've been bitten by things over the years. It can be, sometimes it just won't even work. For example, the current version of Jekyll, that's one of my most popular example repositories, doesn't work at all with Alpine because some of its dependencies don't build on the Musil C libraries. So Alpine isn't always a solution, so I don't recommend it. What I do recommend is Slim. Slim is one of the biggest ways that you can save on CVE count if you're not using it. So if you're using Node 18, change it to Node 18-Slim. If you're using Ruby 3 something, use Ruby 3-Slim. And that will remove a lot of unnecessary apps that you're probably not even using that will reduce your security count and greatly, by hundreds of megs at least, will reduce the size of your image. So that's my advice. And then if not, after that, try Docker Slim and the Slim AI solution. If you're super advanced and you already know everything about all this and you already know what you're doing, I would recommend something like Woofy, which we've had on the show last year. ChainGuard came on, talked about Woofy as a new base image, but that you have to be pretty smart and pretty advanced in your Docker build knowledge. You have to really know what you're doing there, I think. Great questions. Spring Boot guys say friends don't let friends write Docker files. And that's fine. So here's the thing, Dan. It's like, and maybe that was just trying to be a joke, and I take it a little bit as a joke. There are some people who don't want to know how to write Docker files, and I don't entirely agree with that. To me, it's deliberately making yourself ignorant about something that is a core piece of infrastructure today for almost everything we run. So it's almost like saying friends don't make friends. If I said friends don't make if I were to say friends don't let friends make files, I would probably get hated all over the internet. But to me, the Docker file is just the modern equivalent of a make file. I mean, they're both used everywhere. There's millions of Docker files. There's many, many millions of make files. And they largely have a similar structure. You have to understand shell commands. You have to understand piping of things and all the different nuances of shells. And then, of course, the format of the files themselves. So I feel like Dockerfile is necessary. Doesn't mean you have to be a guru. But I do think that every team and every company does need examples and templates. No one should be having to write Docker files from scratch anymore. And that's one area that Docker has tried to solve, but hasn't really yet. Hopefully in the future, I know they're thinking about this problem and how do they help developers not need to write Docker files from scratch. Most of us don't write Kubernetes YAML from scratch. So why do we have to do that for Docker files? The problem is that when you don't really understand the inner workings of a Docker file, it means you can't troubleshoot it. It often means that there's way more stuff in there than you need. So I think eventually someone in the team ends up having to know how to use them, because whatever tool you're using to write them will inevitably have some CVEs or bloat, and then someone in the security team will give you a hard time about it. And then the problem is no one knows how to fix it because they don't really know how to use Docker files. So I don't know. I disagree, but I'm also running a Docker channel, right? So of course I'm going to not agree with that. But I understand that we now have we're getting very specific tooling in specific areas. We've got Java. I think maybe, I'm not sure if it's the Laravel community rather, that has their own custom tooling. And that's okay, as long as you at least have someone there that knows how that tooling works and what problems it's solving. It's kind of like we have Rails on top of Ruby, but it doesn't mean we don't need to know Ruby or how Rails works a little bit underneath in order to take advantage of it. We have all these layers of abstractions. So these tools are just abstractions on top of the idea of Docker files. But you're going to end up having to use them anyway, because not every single tool you're ever going to run and every third-party tool that you need to run is going to be based on that. So at some point, you got to learn them. It's just kind of hard to avoid, I think. All right, I know I'm a little bit behind on the chat. I'm trying to catch up. I'm a release manager, not currently working on containers or a Kubernetes shop. However, I got a few Raspberries and building clusters and build projects in the cluster, where can I find sample projects? Well, Marin, if you've been here the whole time, we just covered all that. I talked about all sorts of stuff, searching on GitHub. Let me know if you can scroll back in time, or you can wait till this video is over and rewatch. But basically, GitHub. If you just search on GitHub, example microservices or example Kubernetes projects, there's a ton of them there. Google has them. Docker themselves have them. And that's a great question. It's just something we've already covered today. Learning OpenShift, sure, that's the right format. I would learn Linux, then Docker, then Kubernetes, then OpenShift. Yeah, because OpenShift is just it's Kubernetes. It's just Kubernetes with some other stuff on top. So you have to know Kubernetes first, and then once you understand what Kubernetes is and what it isn't, you can understand what OpenShift adds on top of it, right? Because there's almost 100 distributions of Kubernetes. They all have the same core Kubernetes. They have to. It's called a Kubernetes certified distribution. And they almost all have it. All the ones I've ever seen all have this certification, which means that the API is the same, the core functionality is the same, the core bits of Kubernetes are all in there, and they just decide what they want to put on top. They have their own custom web GUIs. They might do custom monitoring setups. They might include a backup tool or not. They might include an Ingress or a proxy tool or not. Those are just add-ons, extra features that Kubernetes has that you can add on. That's the whole point. Kubernetes was designed to be extensible. It was designed to be the core functionality minimum feature set in order for everyone to put stuff on top. And that's what OpenShift and a lot of the other ones do. So absolutely. I would learn OpenShift last, because there might be a day where you decide you don't want OpenShift anymore, and you maybe go to Rancher or MicroKates, or Tanzu, or EKS, or a cloud version, or something. And you don't want to be confused about what the difference is between core Kubernetes and what does your distribution put on top of it to make it fancy, right? So yeah, it's a great plan. I agree. I approve. Yes, Corey is a great guy. Let's see. AWS ECS doesn't allow deletion of a task definition when updating a deployment. Is there a better way, or do you just resign to having thousands of revisions if you deploy daily? I'll be honest, I haven't used ECS other than for basic demos since Docker Swarm was released. So I used ECS for about a minute, really more like a year, in 2016, I think. It was basically, to me, a bridge between us not having orchestration and then us having Swarm and Kubernetes. So, and sadly, I don't have the answer to your question. I've worked with some teams that do still use it, but I don't know that specific answer to that question. Maybe someone else in chat can help if they've worked on ECS before. Let's see if we can't help DP. James is back. What's up? Sorry I missed you. It's probably been a minute. Happy 2001. Thanks, man. Thanks for being here. James, I got to get you on the show. So reach out to me. Let's plan a topic. Let's talk about something. If you're still watching, I'm now declaring, even though he doesn't know it, James Spurrier is going to be on the show in the future, and we just need to come up with a topic to talk about, and for him to come on and show some of the stuff he's doing on his channel. By the way, click on James, and it'll take you to his channel. He's got some great content. Don't click on it yet. Click on it after I'm done live. And yeah. All right, Dan's back. Sorry, I'm taking so long to catch up. We have Artifactory, but all our images are just in Docker on each of the worker nodes, except maybe when Kubernetes deletes them to free up space. Yeah, it's a pretty custom setup there, Dan, so it's going to be hard to troubleshoot that. I have worked with companies that use Artifactory for image storage, and my guess is that if it says image pull back off, then it doesn't have that exact image. And what you need to do, and if you're not doing this, you need to go in and basically tell Kubernetes to never pull an image, or to only use images. If you're manually putting them on the workers, then you have to make sure that your YAML policies say image pull equal, I'm trying to remember the YAML specification, but it's like image pull never or something like that. What might be happening is Kubernetes doesn't necessarily pull, Kubernetes and the runtime you're using don't always pull the image the way you might think. They might actually be pulling the image by its SHA, and they'll translate the tag into the SHA. So there might be something going on there that you need to look at to make sure if everything else is running fine and they're all using the same local images on the servers fine, and there's this one that's off. I'm not really sure what the deal is there. That is pretty custom, but you've got a custom setup, so it makes it even harder to help troubleshoot. Because I would say I could count. You're maybe one of 3 people I know that manually put the images on the servers. Okay, so that's a pretty, I would call that bespoke setup. The more appropriate or cloud native design is to store them all on your own registry that's private, like Harbor or something, and then when Kubernetes needs them, it pulls them. It does not. There's nothing that's storing the images on each node. To me, that's just a waste. So it's a waste of effort, waste of space. That's why we have registries. That's why we created private registries. Artifactory, GitHub, Enterprise, you name it. There's dozens now of private registries you can run in your data center, store all your images there. You can have those. A lot of those solutions, including Harbor, will automatically go and pull images to store them and cache them. You can say, basically, go and sync the latest node images or the latest Java images, and it will do it for you. And so your registry will have access to the internet, but not your servers themselves. That's, to me, the more appropriate way to do it. I'm not here to sort of scold you in the moment of crisis when things aren't working. I understand that that's your design, but consider for the future that you might have easier time with some of these problems and possibly save a lot of storage space by following that methodology of the nodes have nothing on them. They always use a registry. They're just configured to use your registry as a pull-through cache, and then you use Artifactory or whatever you're going to use to store those images. That's what I see teams doing today. All right. Hopefully that helps. I'm not sure if it's going to help you troubleshoot, but I'm really hoping you figured that out. What projects are you suggesting for third-year students? Well, it just depends on your maturity level. Have you deployed Kubernetes? Have you set up a bunch of different Docker servers? Have you tried Docker Swarm? Have you used Docker Compose? I have 500 videos in courses below that if you've done all those and you're ready for the next thing, then I would say GitOps, which is my next course. I would say look at GitOps, understand Argo and Flux and the GitOps tools. If you've already known that, start looking at Crossplane, look at Pulumi. These are all things on this show. I would basically, my whole goal for this channel, by the way, is that it's a recipe for all the things that you might be interested in for cloud native distributed computing. So that's the people that I have on this show. They're creating tools, they're making projects, and they're big thinkers around how do we do cloud native design for our infrastructure and how do we get our apps there in the most efficient way possible. That's DevOps. How do we measure all that? How do we improve the speed and the velocity of how we get software to our servers and all over 5 times every minute or however fast you want to go? That's really what this channel is about, and I'm trying to make that. So hopefully you'll find something in here of interest and some of my back catalog of hundreds of videos, and that you can go check out those projects. That's what I would do. If I set you down and you're trying to be someone who's a DevOps engineer or a developer who knows cloud native, I would say, okay, here's your access keys to AWS. Here's my applications. Here's my application Docker files. I would like this application to run in the cloud on a Kubernetes cluster with all the bells and whistles. It needs to be auto-deployed when I make changes to the Git. It needs to be monitored and tracking logs. I need to be aware of security events, like if somebody SSHs into the server, I want to know. If someone runs an exec command inside my containers, I want to know. If there's a shell process running in my containers, I want to know. Like all the bells and whistles. Backups. Let's test the restores of it. How do backups work? I mean, you name it. Eventually, that's the kind of thing we all have to know. We don't have to know it all at once, but that's the kind of thing we have to know. How do you feel about Firecracker, specifically micro VMs, Jason? That's a great question. Firecracker's great. I think it has a lot of utility, and it will probably be around a very long time, and I don't have a need for it. Just because mostly Firecracker to me is for when you're trying to create isolation around unknown protected resources. So you're running a bunch of other people's stuff that you can't control, which is not a lot of teams. I don't necessarily think you need Firecracker if you're a team running your own code or you're running trusted open source. But if you're letting other people run random stuff on your clusters, you probably want something like Firecracker in the middle as a better form of isolation. But I think it's pretty sweet. It's a great idea. gvisor, some of these other things are also great ideas and very useful. Like a lot of this stuff, like the new stuff with WebAssembly, because WebAssembly is also a form of abstraction that is now taking over, will, I think, take over cloud native and become quite popular once we work it out over the next few years, because it's still pretty immature. But WebAssembly is another form of isolation that allows you to better isolate your applications, better lock them down by default, minimize the amount of dependencies and security potential vectors. That's kind of what Firecracker's trying to do, right? Don't allow someone to get out of a container into the host, because their host is another container, essentially. So that's all good stuff. I approve it if you have real need for it. Most teams don't. So TG is asking, how long will DevOps and cloud computing will live? Hopefully for a very long time. Like, cloud computing and DevOps are not new, but aren't going anywhere. So I don't know, decades? Long enough that you should be learning them. If you're here and you're learning them, you're doing fine. There is nothing replacing cloud computing anytime soon. Hell, cloud computing didn't even replace the data center. That's why we have hybrid. Because a decade ago, and I remember this very well, I was in a startup. I was a co-founder of a startup that venture capitalists were trying to tell us that the cloud was the future and that we should not build anything for the data center. And I was arguing with them, essentially telling them, not everyone's going to be able to go to the cloud. It's going to take a long time to go to the cloud. Not everything will make sense there. Some people will have both. We didn't even know what the word hybrid meant back then. And it turns out I was right. We now have expanded. We don't just have cloud. We now have edge, and we have data center, and all of them together are hybrid, and we have a lot. And so cloud computing, just like everything else, we don't really get rid of things. We still have mainframes. There's people that still have jobs running mainframes. We still do COBOL. So these things are going to stay around a long time. High performance computing. If you need it, great. I don't do it. I'm not an expert in it. It's not that it's bad. It's necessary. It's just like GPU workloads, machine learning, and all the other stuff. Big data, data lakes. Those are all necessary things. I don't really. Sorry, I'm not trying to be snarky. I don't know anything about it, and I don't think it. To me, it doesn't really change a whole lot about containers. Things need to be run, they need to be shipped and updated, they need to be fast as possible. So with high performance computing, you're going to be dealing with GPUs, picking the right instance types, making sure that everything can take advantage of all that. And containers are still one of the ways to do that. So I think, that's what gives legs to the Docker paradigm, is that it runs in all these scenarios. It runs on satellites. It runs on rock busters for NASA. It runs in the shuttle, or whatever, in the Artemis and all the latest stuff. It runs in Teslas probably. It can run everywhere. So the future of Kubernetes and DevOps, watch this channel every week. That's the future. We have on new projects all the time. We have on all the latest tech. In fact, one thing I did want to get through, and I haven't even had a chance to go through the README, is Docker just released a new version today. Not a minor version. Moby. So we're going to have a whole show about this coming up. And I don't even think they've made an announcement yet, but they just released a brand new major version of Docker, and they're changing the versioning back to the original versioning. If you've been here long enough, Docker started with Symver, then moved to date-based, and now is going back to Symver. They have a tag 8 hours ago talking about the new release version 23.00. And there's a lot to get through. All right, a lot. Did I say it's a lot? It's a lot. So what does this all mean? When is this coming to a Docker near you? Those are all valid questions, and we don't know. I don't know yet. We're actually all in the Captain's channel, getting ready to probably spend the next few weeks talking about it, learning it. You'll see endless blog posts because Docker hasn't had a major release in at least 3 years. So it's a big deal. I'm really very interested in the deprecated features as much as I am in the new features, because Docker experiments a lot and what's going away. Over the years, a lot of things have come and gone. So I'm very interested in that. You will hear from me on this way more in the coming weeks. So stay tuned. Come back on Thursdays. Yes, ChatGPT for Docker files does work, but I would argue even better than ChatGPT is GitHub's Copilot. GitHub's Copilot is the best. So far, it outpaces any other thing that I see for AI-generated developer content, whether it's customized Kubernetes YAML, Docker files, Compose files, JavaScript, Golang, Markdown, regular text, doesn't matter. Check out GitHub Copilot. What's up, Mike? Thanks for the thanks. With the advent of ChatGPT, do you think DevOps engineers will still be in high demand? Okay, so this is a great question. There is only one answer, and that is absolutely yes. And let me see if I can find the tweet from Kumar. Let's see if I can find this tweet. Because I don't want to steal. I'm going to steal their thunder. But see if I can find it. Come on. See how fast I can be. It's not Kumar. Actually, I think it's Kunal. So over here, see if I can find. Congratulations, by the way, for those that all got their GitHub star. I someday will be cool enough to have one of those. I do not have a GitHub star. I have a lot of GitHub stuff and followers. All right, here's the tweet. AI will not replace you. A person who's using AI will replace you. This is the problem. So the answer is yes. DevOps is in high demand. You can't replace millions of jobs with an AI robot that's only accurate 50% of the time. You can't. The whole world would burn if ChatGPT took over. These things will take a long time. AI is going to seem like it's moving fast, but we have had these AI, we've had IntelliSense for 20 years. Do you know what IntelliSense is? IntelliSense is Visual Studio telling you what code you need in the line you're typing it, giving you options and letting you pick from them and then helping you fill it out, telling you when that line was wrong. That was the beginnings of AI. So another friend of mine, Laura, actually talks about how many if-then statements in our programs does there have to be before it's called AI. So that's another good tweet I need to put out there is AI is really just this large language model thing that we're all talking about lately. And if you want to get into AI, I am not the person to get into it in terms of the underlying principles. But you take a bunch of stuff that we've already done, and then you feed it into machines, and then they can extrapolate certain things about that, and it helps them make decisions based on what data previously happened. But they can't predict the future. They can't do new things that have never existed. These large language models are entirely dependent upon history and the things we've done to come up with the things. So it's not making anything that's never been done. Often, we're all creating things that are new ideas, right? And your setup and your DevOps solutions are not exactly like anyone else's. They're going to be slightly different. So the way that AI is going to bleed into our lives, it's already here. I'm using at least a half a dozen tools that have AI in them. I'm using a Google search replacement that has AI in it called Neva. And if I search Docker Hub, it gives me an AI response based on stuff it read on the internet. Right, so it's actually a little bit more accurate than ChatGPT because it's not based on 2-year-old data. It's based on real things, and it cites its sources so that you can go verify that it's factual, because ChatGPT is wrong a lot. All right, so we already have that. Then in VS Code, we have Copilot, which I use every day. It's great. It's easily worth, if you're a professional working in this space, it's easily worth the money for Copilot. It's filling in my Markdown. It's recommending me finishing my sentences. It's telling me code. It's telling me DevOps, all the things, Docker files, manifests, Terraform, Ansible. It's all in there. All right. I use Notion, and I now have Notion, which is just a project management blogging like interface tool that does a lot of things like Evernote and Google has made for years in web. But Notion is this other app that I do a ton of stuff in. It's got AI text generation in it. So I use that. So I now have AI tools at the command line that help predict what the command I want to type is, and it's going to give me recommendations on finishing the command. Those tools actually aren't that great yet, so I don't even recommend them. But this stuff isn't going to replace you. It's just going to make you do more. Guess what Docker did? Docker helped you do more. Kubernetes, guess what it did? It helped you do more things. When I was a developer, and mostly just a sysadmin 15 years ago, I could maybe manage 100 servers full-time, right? If I full-time managed servers, 100 servers was about it for me. That was a stretch, right? Keeping them patched, keeping them working, keeping them properly monitored, making sure they're backed up, making sure their restores work, making sure that they can connect and the networking was fast, making sure the hardware failures were replaced. That was it. 100 servers max, absolutely max. And then we got virtual machines, and suddenly now it was 300 servers, not 100 servers. Now a single person can manage way more than that with automation and Terraform and Ansible and Docker and Kubernetes and AWS. You can manage fleets and fleets of servers now as an individual. You can have dozens of repositories that manage thousands of servers, all controlled by one human. We couldn't do that 15 years ago. So is that AI? No. But that's the continual pace of technology. So what this AI is going to enable us to do is just do more things faster. I don't think in the near term it has any way to replace a human. In fact, right now, it's not even good enough to replace like a blogger. Because if you write decent blog articles, it ain't that great. I have it write stuff for me, and it sucks. I never want to use it. In fact, people on the internet, we're going to have this revolt. This is what's going to happen. We're going to have people starting to generate all this content. It's already happening now. Content's going to get generated, and we're going to end up going the other way. So we are going down this massive hole of AI-generated content. It will be around for 5 years or something. And then what's going to happen is those of us that hand create our own content, artisanal, human-created content, will become valuable again because we'll realize how original thought is actually more valuable than rehashing old ideas, which is all large language models do. So I think it's just a hype cycle. I think it's really just another tool. It's like the cloud. We all got super excited about the cloud, and in its early days, and we're like, the cloud's going to take over everything. The cloud's going to replace all servers. Where all data centers are gone. And now we realize, oh, that's not true. We still have closets. We still have Edge. We even invented Edge. We didn't have Edge 15 years ago. We didn't call it Edge. And we've invented more ways to not use the cloud. So I think this is just a new tool that will be bleeding in. But your job as a DevOps professional is to get a handle on what tools you have that can use AI. And so the person next to you, if they're learning the new tooling, and this AI stuff's going to bleed into all our tools. Eventually, AWS stuff will have it. You'll be using the AWS command line, and it'll have AI intelligence built in or something. I'm guessing. I don't have any insight here. But, VS Code will be one of the major ways we interface with plugins that are making decisions for us. And that's already happening today. That's been happening for years. So it's just going to happen more and more. What I'm excited about, and what we talked about a few weeks ago, and I don't know that this exists yet, but eventually I want to tell Siri or VS Code, whatever. I want to type into VS Code or talk into VS Code and say, please make me a React app with the demo sample app on the latest version, the templating of like everything, whether it's Svelte or React or whatever it might be, whatever you're using, there's always like that demo starter template thing. I tell it, hey, create me a new repo on GitHub called this with this language, clone it to my machine, set up the standard Docker file from the official recommendations, add a compose file to it, and then have that connected through Argo on GitOps to go to AWS, right? On using, App Runner or whatever, or using an EKS cluster. Set up one EKS cluster with 3 nodes. Like, I want to be able to tell it that, and then it just does that, right? And today, we have that with layers of tooling like Terraform. We already have Terraform that can do a lot of this stuff across disparate tools. It can talk to GitHub. It can talk to AWS. It can use all these things at once. And then we have AI in VS Code that can help me write the Terraform based on comments. So we're getting there. But once this starts to be able to become AI aware in terms of the AI knows what Terraform is, the AI is responsive to my requests, then I'm no longer deciding how many Terraform files I need. Because if you think about it, right now, Copilot in VS Code is file-centric. It only knows the file you're in. It focuses on that file. So as we mature, that's going to come out of the file, and it's going to be project-centric. So I can describe to a project, maybe in the README file, I can describe it's going to use Terraform and Docker and EKS, and the applications are going to have a Postgres backend and a Redis, and it's going to have a worker process that pulls the record. I'm going to describe the architecture, and then it's going to create a whole new thing with a whole new template and understand what Git repos are and how to push things into the cloud and understand registries. Like, once it understands all of that, and it's going to take years to do, but it's still going to be a human doing that. They're just going to be able to save time by not having to create tons of boilerplate. And the boilerplate is going to be one of the first things I think that goes. When you look at all of these Copilot examples, everybody talks about Copilot all the time or ChatGPT, it's very rudimentary stuff, right? They're creating functions. They're not creating apps. It's not creating an entire front end and back end API for a web app. It's creating a function. So we're in the very early stages of that, and it'll get just more complicated from there. But I'm excited because a lot of this stuff we're all doing every day, but we all know how to do it to varying degrees. So it's not special knowledge. It's just time consuming, and it's a little bit repetitive. So it'll solve that problem, I think, first, before it starts replacing humans. All right, I'm going to shut up on that and just catch up on the chat. Thanks for being here. And my voice is going, so I'm going to have to quit soon. So get your questions in now, and I'll try to answer them short. Get some short answers in. But this was all that whole 5-minute rant was started by ProRen and Jatanya. Jayana. Jayana? Sorry if I mispronounced that. And Mike, and that's kind of Mike's question about AI. No, I think that there's a saying that for every engineer, every IT engineer, there are two jobs. The one that they have and the one that someone needs to fill. No amount of automation is going to change that. There's no sign of that stopping. I've been doing this for almost 30 years. Every time when virtualization came around, when the cloud came around, when Linux and the innate ability to automate Linux over Windows came out and got really popular. I mean, all these things, we were all worried, okay, people are losing their jobs. Well, guess what? There was another job available because tech and software is eating the world. Every company is a software company. Everybody needs more help. So the ones that know how to control the robots will be the ones that always have a job availability, always be able to get jobs. So learn AI, watch podcasts about it. This show is going to have a lot of new tools on it about AI. So stay tuned. We're going to talk a lot about it. It's going to be fun. How do you manage hundreds of deployments? I mean, you configure alerts or a Slack bot to detect downtime or resource limits. Yeah, Julio. I mean, the reality is no one goes from no deployments to 100 deployments in one day. You have to build over time. You have to build your stack of tools. So you start with one deployment, and then you get to 10, and then you realize, I need a new tool to make this part easier. I need alerts inside of PagerDuty or Slack or Discord or wherever you are. And then you realize those alerts need to be tuned. After you've got 25 deployments, you realize I need some better alerting, but these alerts are happening too often, so I'm going to have to tune those because they're happening too often and they're not that important. So you have to tune them. And then you have to add another tool because you realize you have a new problem. So you build it layer by layer over time. I don't know anyone that goes from 0 to 100, right? You have to go slowly and you evolve and mature. And eventually, by the time you get to 100 deployments, you have a bunch of tools, mostly automated, that you've learned over the course of years or months, maybe if you're a team going really fast. And you've evolved, you've matured. You're scanning logs for different specific messages to then alert on because you're now aware of them. You're monitoring endpoints better because you're aware more of the potential failures because you've had failures. We all learn from failure. So you kind of have to learn from that, and you just kind of have to have them to learn those lessons and understand what you were missing. Because no system is perfect. No automation or monitoring tool is perfect out of the gate or even now. So you have to constantly evolve it over time, and you'll learn as you go. If you don't know how to do 100, and if you can't even fathom that, fathom 10. Think about 10. How would you design your infrastructure and your code and your YAML and all your configuration? How would you design it if you were deploying one today, but you might have to deploy 9 more tomorrow? Act as if. I see a lot of teams that if they're not maturing, they're just running command lines all day. And then they're like, okay, I don't remember these commands, so now I'm pasting them into a notebook. I'm keeping them in my Evernote or in my Notion. I'm tracking the commands I have to type. Well, there's probably a better way. You probably need to automate those things. Put them into Git. Store them in a place that can be automated. And so often teams, the best teams are the ones that aren't trying to solve the problem for today. They're trying to solve the problem they have today, but solving it as if it was going to happen 100 times again. So one of the rules of a good team is if you have a failure, let's design the monitoring solution. If you have a failure you didn't know about, you fix the monitoring solution so that you'll always know about it. If you have a failure, you try to correct so that that failure never can happen again, that it auto heals. And teams are always looking ahead to this problem isn't going away. I don't want it to keep happening, so I'm going to fix it now. Those are the best teams. So think about your approach when you're writing the commands for a script. that will build your infrastructure. What would it do if you changed it to be 10 times bigger infrastructure, 10 times as much? Would anything change? Would your Terraform change? Would you need to make that one Terraform value and a variable that you can configure on the fly? And that's what you do. You design it now with those configurable variables in this example, so that later you can come back and simply change that value, and then boom, everything's bigger. That's the mature teams that really know what they're doing. They can see ahead. They're like, this problem is not going to go away. I don't want to just run that one-line command because that one-line command is only going to solve today's problems. So I'm going to build a way for that to never be a problem, whether I'm automating the command or I'm documenting it and then going back and fixing the original solution, or I'm maybe making my automation more flexible, you name it. Great question, though. That's a great discussion. Gulam asks around container metrics. Do or do not. There is no try. I want to do it right. Which metrics are most usable and worthy to monitoring? Which metrics tools are the most cloud native now? I think when it comes to metrics, if we were all using the same app, if we were all monitoring the same app, which we're not by a long shot, we all have our own custom apps, then how do I tell you what the right tool is to monitor your custom app, right? So the apps that you use and the metrics you monitor vary widely, and I mean widely, based on a lot of factors, including the maturity of your team. How many people do you have to do this job? How much money do you have to do this job? Do you have money to go buy tools like Datadog or New Relic or a hosted solution for Prometheus that's self-contained and automatically works out of the box? If you have that money, then do that, because those tools are cheaper than humans. And monitoring is never done. You're never done improving your monitoring solution. So I can't give you metrics, because I could just say CPU, memory, disk, but those metrics, those are built into every tool you design. Every tool you install is going to have those metrics. So it's a little bit of an obvious answer. But the metrics that are really going to matter to you are the ones that you care about in the moment. Some teams have no concern for the first 6 months of their new product about how many connections they're getting concurrently on their website, until the day they're on the front page of Reddit and suddenly they're now inundated with millions of connections a minute and their site goes down. I know this because it happened to me. I was on a team. We got front page of Reddit. Site couldn't handle the traffic. The metrics we needed in that moment, we never needed before, so we didn't have them. And were we too dumb to not know that we would need them in the future? Well, we weren't planning for being on the front page. We weren't planning to go from, a couple of thousand a minute to a couple of million a minute. We weren't planning on that. We weren't designing the solution for that. So metrics are an elusive thing that you're going to constantly, need to evolve. And you're going to have templates. So if you go look at Prometheus, you go look at Grafana. These are common tools. I'm not saying you need to run it yourself. You may not even choose to use Prometheus. You might use the clouds version. You might use a Kubernetes distribution that comes with tools out of the box. And you just use those tools. It's all fine. But it takes time. And I think, honestly, monitoring, metrics, observation, those are things that really require a lot of time and maturity in your career to understand. If you gave me a very specific tool and you gave me a very specific scenario, like you said, we are using this website, this API in this language, we built it ourselves, and this is how many customers we have, and we're on the internet where things can go badly quickly, and we're hosted here, and these are the tools we're using, and this is the budget I have, and these are the number of people I have, and this is their skill set. I could then maybe give you some metrics. So the consulting answer is it absolutely depends, and you just need to keep playing. There's no reason to track a metric you never look at. If you never have disk performance problems, if your apps are never slow, then why monitor disk performance on SSDs? SSDs are so fast now. In most cases, people can avoid the metric altogether. They can just avoid, disk I/O. It's not normally the problem anymore, assuming you're on SSDs. So why track it? I used to tell everybody you had to monitor disk. It was so important on database servers and caching, anything that was reading from disk constantly, or in worst case, writing to disk. File upload speeds. These were huge bottlenecks because disks were the bottleneck. So we were always tracking. We were tracking not just the I/O of disks. We were tracking the queue length. Does anyone out there remember what queue length is on disks? We were tracking all sorts of metrics that no one cares about probably anymore because that's no longer a common bottleneck. But there's a few people that still do because they're database admins and they're running huge databases and they have to care about what RAID cluster size is and what is their total I/O max performance and what's their queue length and all these other metrics that matter in storage. But 99% of us don't ever have to care about that. So it's tough for me to give you generic stuff. What I would say, if you're going to try something out to start with, try out Prometheus. Go look at Grafana dashboards. There's a bunch of templates, and you can see a bunch of the different stuff. And you can learn what types of metrics there are. And if you start to learn Prometheus, you will learn the different types of built-in metrics. And these come from the system. But those aren't the most important ones. Often the most important ones are in your apps. MySQL has its own metrics that are very specific to MySQL. And a proxy server like HA Proxy or Nginx has its own metrics that are specific to that app. And if you're going to use Nginx, you have to learn those. They're unique to Nginx, and you have to learn them in order to understand high-performing Nginx clusters. I had a job once where we had to learn the difference between Nginx's metrics and HA Proxy's metrics because we had scaling problems on a worldwide level, and we had to learn which one of these tools would meet our needs. And it turned out in that case, HA Proxy, the free version, had better metrics at the time, a decade ago. It had better metrics than Nginx. So we chose HA Proxy because it had some specific metrics on problems we were trying to solve, and we switched. And that's very unique. No one else would probably ever care about those metrics until they had the problem we have. So I think it's more important that you understand the systems and then learn how to find out the metrics. And you know what all this leans on? You have to know networking. You have to know Linux. And you have to know hardware. You have to know the different metrics for common CPUs, the different metrics for storage, the different metrics for networking. You have to understand TCP and the nature of TCP packets and TCP connections. Those are all fundamentals. And if you don't know those fundamentals, learning Prometheus is going to be pretty hard because I'm going to tell you a metric in Prometheus that has to do with the open connections on a TCP long polling HTTP connection. Go look that one up. It's very specific to a very specific protocol needed in a very specific use case, but it relies on the fundamental understandings of TCP and how connections work. And if you don't know those fundamentals, Prometheus will just it'll be so cryptic and confusing you won't know what you're looking at. So I would say before you know metrics and know monitoring, make sure you know, and maybe you do, maybe you're the pro on TCP, UDP, all the common IP protocols, IP6 versus IP4, routers, switching, packet sizes, virtual interfaces, all those things. Go learn that, because that you will learn once and you will use it your entire career. Prometheus won't last forever. We'll have different ways of collecting metrics in the future, but at least for the last 30 years, TCP version 4 or IP version 4 has been the protocol of most of the internet. Obviously, IPv6 is continuing to grow, but we've had that around for 20 years and it hasn't replaced IPv4 yet. So, these things at the low levels move really slow. And my Cisco certifications that I got in the 90s, that's right, the 90s. When I got those in the 90s, most of that stuff is still true today and is still valuable today. The Security Plus certification, the Network Plus certification, the Linux Plus, all Linux certifications, those are all valuable for your entire career. Learning how to build my own kernel in 1997 or whatever on BSD, still a very valuable lesson 30 years later. I learned a lot about drivers and what kernels were and what compilers were and how systems booted. All those things are super valuable. So that's a great question. I'm going to leave it at that because we're running out of time. On recommendations on practice for CKAD, go to GitHub. Tons of repos. Look on GitHub. Sadahi, go look on GitHub for like CKHD. I'm not looking for answers. You're not looking to cheat. What you're looking for is examples. So look up CKHD example questions or CKHD questions or whatever test that you're trying to accomplish. Usually if it's a developer or DevOps focused test, people are going to be coming up with their own example questions and putting them on GitHub. So I would look there. Some of those repos have lots of stars, thousands of stars. So try all of them. I mean, none of them are guaranteed to be right. So I would say practice as much as you can. I've taken over 30 certifications and I've never failed one. And that's because I practice. And to be fair, I typically don't take a test on something I don't know. I wait till I've used it and I've learned it before I take the test. But that's not everyone. Sometimes you have to take the test that you don't know. How much effort do you think about converting your legacy application to cloud native one? I think it's absolutely dependent. It's a really hard question to answer, and I will just say it depends. I've seen applications that you can change no code. Most applications don't require any code changes to put them into Docker, and then you can run it on Kubernetes. And then if it's a monolith, just leave it like that. Is it broken? Does it not work right? Does it perform well? Is it maintainable? Then don't change it. But if you're continuing to evolve the application and you need to do new things with it, the most common approach is to first containerize it, put it in Docker, put it in Kubernetes, and then start taking chunks of it one at a time, one little topic, one little subject area of that app, and then take it off and put it into its own separate service. Doesn't have to be a microservice. Just put it out as a separate service. If your website and your API are together, or if your API is also doing long-running jobs, maybe take the long-running jobs part and turn it into a worker process. Take it out of that main app that's running the backend API so that the API runs faster, shorter things, and then the things that have to run in a batch-like scenario, they run in a separate container. And that's how I see teams doing it. For new features, for every new feature, you have to ask yourself, does this go in the monolith or should I create a separate app for that? And make that your process. That's what most teams that I see do. It's not extremely scientific. There's not an incredible methodical approach. It's just more about preventing your app, your monolith, from growing and growing and growing bigger. And if it performs well and it's fast and it's stable, then there's nothing wrong. There's nothing you need to do cloud native. The thing that you need to follow, if there's anything, is there any guide? It's not a new guide. It's been around for over a decade. Probably at this point, 15 years. I would recommend go read, and if you've already read it, reread it every year, the 12-factor app, 12factor.net. Go read that. It will give you the guiding principles that help. These are around before Docker. These guiding principles were essentially the beginning of us developing a language for describing cloud native, or back then what we just called distributed applications. So 12-factor, it's got 12 different topics. They're not very long, but they're very important, and all of them still apply today. If I had access to this website, I might add some things to it, but I don't think I would take anything away. I wouldn't necessarily add more factors. I would maybe just expand on some of the modern ways that we're approaching solving these problems. But those of you out there, you're probably reading this and you're like, yeah, I remember 12-factor. Well, it's still relevant. These are the guiding principles for how Docker was created, for how cloud native was designed, for how distributed computing. And if you want to read books, look up O'Reilly and just look up O'Reilly Cloud Native. And you'll find some cloud native books, or look up distributed computing, O'Reilly distributed computing. Yeah, so here's a whole book, O'Reilly Distributed Systems. Here's one called Designing Distributed Systems. This is one I have by one of the authors or one of the original founders of the Kubernetes project. Yeah, and then there's cloud native books. There's other books there. O'Reilly is great for that. Manning is also another great publisher, but it all comes back, I think, to 12-factor. So I would go reread that, start from there. With every team that seems to really not get the basics of Docker, like they're confused about why Docker exists. Even when I teach it to them, they're still confused about the principles of it. The idea that we don't want to change things in production, that we want to replace, we want to delete and recreate. We don't want to augment things. We want them to be sort of a read-only approach. All those original concepts came from here. So check it out. 12-factor. That's a great question. All right. Will you make a video of Gateway API versus Ingress? Julio, we already did that. I had the Gateway team on the show from Google. Go back in time and search this channel for Gateway API. We talked about it possibly almost 2 years ago in 2021, not 2001. 2021, almost 2 years ago, and not much changed. It's just it's gone from alpha maybe to beta, but the gateway API for you don't need the gateway API until you have the problems that Ingress can't solve. And how do you know that? If you're using Ingress and it meets your needs, you're fine. You're fine. Just keep using Ingress, because gateway is more complex. It's optional. So if you're thinking that gateway is going to do all the things and replace all the things, it's not. It is meant to solve specific problems on top of basic proxying that Ingress provides. It's meant to allow you to do gating, or basically prevent certain developers from having access to any URL that you could throw into Ingress. This helps you sort of scope out different levels of your load balancing solutions, and so that certain people have access to certain parts. Maybe you don't want everyone to be able to put in a new Ingress rule for your website.com/blog. Maybe only certain people are allowed to use that URL, right? That's what the Gateway API is all about, is helping to put the portions and the permissions around certain parts where they need to be in the team. But if you're a small team, if you're a team of one, if you're a team of 2 or 3, and you're doing all the work, if you're the one creating all the Ingress rules, you probably don't need Gateway API. Ingress will work just fine for you. Service monitoring on Kubernetes through eBPF. Zishan, great question. Do it. We have had eBPF on this show multiple times. Just in the last 6 months, we've had episodes on eBPF. To me, eBPF is just a method. It's just a tool. It's a way for the apps you already use, like Falco or Tracy or Selenium, or just about any of the networking tools in Kubernetes. They all use eBPF at this point in one way or another. So it's just a method to gain access to more raw data for the tools to do their job better. It's not something that you need to study unless you're a developer who wants to develop against the the Linux kernel. If you want to develop on the Linux kernel, then you need to learn how eBPF internals work. But we talk about that on this show too. Go back in time. I've had multiple episodes with Liz Rice and other people on eBPF. Liz Rice wrote one of the books on eBPF for cloud native computing. So go look up episodes of her, and yeah, you can find out a lot about it. But I think largely it's just, to me, it's what if the Linux kernel came out with a new feature that your tools took advantage of? Would you really care to learn all about tools that use that protocol? Or would you just use the tools you're already using, and if those tools adopted that protocol, then so be it, right? That's kind of what eBPF is to me. I don't need to go looking for eBPF tools because it's not an end of itself. It doesn't solve problems if I don't have those problems to begin with. So what I do is I just use the tools I'm doing all day, and look, my tool now supports certain things through eBPF. It's now smarter or faster or better. But I don't see people adopting new tools just because they have eBPF support. All right. It is a very cool technology, but it's very low level, and Kubernetes itself doesn't use it. It's usually for networking or security. That's mostly what it's about. Networking, observability, security are the core principles there. And the tools either use it or they don't. So I don't really have a list of like my favorite tools that use eBPF, because that would just be a list of my favorite tools, and they may or may not use eBPF. If that's what you're asking, I hope that makes sense. Ajay, my question from the last session: how do I move or switch careers from Linux application support L2 to cloud engineer? Well, I assume, Ajay, you're learning the cloud, so you're already learning something like AWS. You're learning the basics, and you're going to probably take an AWS certification. And however you like to learn. Do you learn by doing? Do you learn by taking courses? Do you learn by reading books? You watch YouTube? All those places have AWS. So learn AWS. And then if you already know Linux, great, because a lot of people don't. A lot of people save Linux for last, and that's, I think, a mistake. So good for you. You've already got the server down. Now learn how the server's running in the cloud, and learn about all those other, not all of them, maybe a dozen AWS cloud services, and then you'll have a good start. And focus on the certifications. Go understand and learn AWS certifications. Figure out your path, because that's what they're designing them to do. AWS's certification and training programs are designed to help you learn on a path from beginner to expert. So you start with the beginner certifications and you work your way up. And that path is, there's entire teams of people managing that process at AWS. So they're very smart. They're not going to be smarter than me. I'm sorry, they are smarter than me. I'm not going to be smarter than that and give you better advice. So I would say first, go look up AWS's training and certification site and learn about their different programs and focus on that. And then once you've decided what your learning path is going to be, then you can go look up specific tools like EC2 or AWS load balancers or RDS databases, and you can start focusing on drilling down in each one of those, and that's how you learn it. That's what I would do. Hope that helps. What open source projects would you suggest to contribute to for beginners? You don't necessarily have to contribute first. Are you creating your own open source? If you're learning, aren't you learning with other tools? Like, what are you learning right now? Docker, Kubernetes, web technologies, programming languages? If you're learning those, you should be learning in the open. So the step one is go create your GitHub account. Get your GitHub account. Start making repositories of what you're learning. If you're learning Docker, put that stuff in a repository. If you're learning programming languages, put what you're learning in there. Write Markdown. So you first got to do your own open source. And then you're going to learn how Git works, how GitHub works, how pull requests work. And then once you've got those tools down, then I would recommend finding your favorite open source tool and just being there. Just be around. Read through other people's issues in GitHub and reply to them. Give them your tips. If you know anything about that tool, it's your favorite open source tool, you can help them there. So you don't want your first day in open source to be writing code for someone else's program unless you really know that program. So it takes time. And the best new people that show up in my courses and show up on my open source, They tell me how they're using it and how it's not working right. And they're asking questions. Or they're maybe making suggestions like, hey, I'm using Jekyll and I appreciate your Jekyll, Bret. Thank you so much. What am I doing with your Jekyll? I'm doing this. And then we have a conversation and they realize, oh, well, my use case is different and I'm the maintainer. So I will suggest, hey, if you'd like to make a pull request, you can, and you can enhance my repository with your ideas. But that has to happen organically. That has to happen as a part of a human-to-human relationship. So you need those relationships, which means you've got to get involved. You've got to hang out where they hang out. And it's got to be something interesting to you. Don't just go pick some random project that you know nothing about, that you don't care about. So if you are really interested in something like Docker, if you think that that's a fantastic tool, well, go hang out in the Docker forums. Go hang out in the Docker issues on GitHub. There's thousands of them. They could all use your help. And it's going to force you to learn. If you're trying to help others, sometimes one of the best ways to learn is to help others. And that doesn't require that you write code, right? But that's still a part of open source. Open source takes more than code. It takes documentation, examples, blog entries, chat, forum help, Stack Overflow. These are all parts of the open source ecosystem, and they all deserve credit. It's not just the coders that get these little dots. Those people get the dots, but the rest of us, that's why you can get these dots from doing other things besides code. You can get the dots in your GitHub repo, in your user profile. You can do that by commenting on other people's things, or submitting issues, or closing issues because you actually help them solve their problem. And that teaches you a lot. And you need to know all that stuff before you start in open source with actual code. Okay? Hopefully that helps. The 23 version of our Docker broke all of our CI/CD pipelines today. Lost 2 hours of it. Docker directory won't be created. Maybe don't deploy. I mean, is it deploying on apt right now? I haven't seen that yet. So my suggestion is, I'm sorry that's happened to you, but you deploy the brand new version of Docker within hours of it being released. And it's not even been announced yet, right? There's no announcement on their blog as far as I know. So that's a good story. That's a good story to say we shouldn't all be running the latest release of something. I just installed Docker last night on a Linux server, and it did not install v23. So I'm not sure how you got that. Actually, what I'm interested in, sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. I'm not even going to try. But I'm interested, actually, did you accidentally install it, or did you purposely install it? I mean, if you purposely did it, if you're just trying to experiment, great. But if you accidentally installed it, that tells me that you're not pinning versions, and you should be. You should always be pinning versions. But it sounds like you've had enough pain today, so I'm not here to lecture you. Hopefully you get it fixed. I would definitely go back to the stable version of v20, 2004 or whatever it was. You would like to know about the Helm file project? We need to deploy to several namespaces while having shared variables. What I think about the Helm file project, is the Helm file project different than Helm? I'm not aware of it. Somebody maybe have to tell me in chat. I don't know if the Helm file is different than Helm. Sorry, I don't know that. Most teams I find don't need Helm. It's just an added unnecessary complexity. And I'm not a huge fan of Helm hooks. They don't always work the way you expect, and they are surprisingly limited, in at least the way I've wanted to use them, and they're not Kubernetes native. So I'd rather do something that's inside of Kubernetes, not something that's in a command line tool. The problem I have, I mean, if it was something that was inside Kubernetes itself acting as a controller, that's different. but Helm is doing a lot of the fancy stuff that it's doing in a command line tool, which I have found in large teams to be a problem. I still like Helm for deploying advanced tools, database clusters, stuff like that, with ease of use commands. But I don't tend to write Helm files with the teams I work with. We use Customize. I find it's easier to use, easier to digest and understand, less edge cases because it's just YAML. There's nothing fancy about it. I feel like there's better tools now for doing some of the more advanced things that Helm can do. So it doesn't mean there's not a place for Helm. It's definitely got its own place, but it's usually reserved for people that are creating their own tools that are really advanced and complicated to install that they need to give to others that don't know anything about it. And I think that's a great use for Helm, but that's probably one of the few times I'd ever would use it. That's what I think. Hopefully that helps. A roadmap for an entry-level job as junior DevOps engineer. I have a page for that. Bret.show/DevOps. I also have blog entries on my website. So, Zaman, if you're still on, go to, actually that URL is probably not going to work. Let me try that one. Yeah, that one's clickable. So go try that page. There are also blog posts on my website, bretfisher.com. If you scroll down, there's some articles on the best ways, DevOps engineer, becoming a DevOps engineer. So go check that out on my website. Hopefully that'll help. All right, I can't seem to catch up with all the questions. These are great. I appreciate them. Ajay is back with another question. If I have two choices, that one is into Java development like Spring Boot, etc., and other into AWS support, my experience is into Linux application support, what would be the best option? Well, I don't quite understand the question, Ajay. An AWS support job probably isn't being a full-time developer. A Spring Boot developer is a full-time developer. So if your job as a Linux application support person was being a developer and developing code all day, then sure, Spring Boot and Java is great. It's one of the most popular languages in the world, and it's not going away. Java is everywhere. But AWS support sounds more like maybe a sysadmin or maybe a cloud architect or maybe a Linux expert. And that sounds more like what your title is, but that's a tough, you would have to explain a lot more about exactly what your day-to-day work was. But it sounds to me like AWS support is more closely aligned with Linux application support, at least by the titles. Can you name a few tools in DevOps which will be in demand in coming days? Yes, Docker and Kubernetes. And I'm not being facetious. I'm not trying to be silly. If you don't know those really well, they will serve you for a long time. So learn the cloud, learn Docker, learn Linux, learn Kubernetes. Those are the things I've been saying for years, and they're still some of the most popular topics everywhere. So check it out. NSX, do you think ChatGPT is secure enough to write code without security holes in the code? No. ChatGPT knows nothing about security. It's simply repeating things that it's seen in the past. It doesn't know whether the code's going to work. It hasn't tested it. It knows nothing about it. Anything you write in code with AI is likely to have problems. So it does not substitute knowledge. It does not replace knowledge. It helps you learn, and it helps you save keystrokes. But today, that's all it can do. Again, I mean, these large language models, the way that ChatGPT works, as far as I know, is it's only replacing the next word. It only thinks about the next word. It doesn't know what it's going to write in 3 minutes for secure code. It doesn't know anything about that. So when you say, write me some secure code, what it's doing is it's going and looking into this huge database, this giant database of all of the Stack Overflows that it's seen and all of the open source it's seen. And it's just saying, well, someone else said this was secure, and this word secure was on the page. So I'm going to use that inside of my model. And I'm going to say, but it doesn't really know if it's secure. It doesn't even know what the word secure means. It's not a thinking machine. It's simply spitting out text based on a giant database of text. So no, absolutely, I would not trust it. I'm not saying you can't use something like Copilot. GitHub Copilot is going to be way better and way more specific to the solution than ChatGPT. But you still would have to test it. You would still have to have security reviews. You still have to use static analysis tools, scanners, all the things that we have to use. You would absolutely still have to use that on the same code. So it doesn't save you any of those steps. It's just going to maybe save you keystrokes on boilerplate stuff. Let me know in chat if you disagree with that. But I mean, ChatGPT can't even describe who I am correctly. Every time I ask it who Bret Fisher Docker is, it's wrong. 50% of the time, it's got 50% wrong text. So it can't even accurately describe a person who's all over the internet. How is it accurately going to write secure code? The problem with it is it's so incorrect and it doesn't know that it's wrong. It will write the world's best code and then it will write the world's worst code all in one. It won't even know. It's not self-aware. Tura, I'm going to just say that. So this is an interesting question. If one DevOps team can control several application deployments, doesn't that mean compared to developers, there will be fewer openings for new DevOps engineers? No, not at all. The pace of technology has always outpaced the ability for humans to make it. Our need for software is outpacing the number of humans that can write it and the number of humans that can deploy it. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if tomorrow the AI is suddenly able to help you write code on every tool for every person on the planet. You know what that's going to do? That's going to mean we're going to want more software. We're going to want more apps. We're going to invent new companies. Companies will then compete better. All those companies that don't have good software today will have better software because they have more people to do it. It doesn't matter. The world's lust and thirst for developers and DevOps and engineering in general has never waned in my entire career since 1993. So there's no empty job boards. There's still, I think AWS, last I checked last year, had 30,000 job openings before they fired a bunch of people. But no, I am not worried at all about jobs. I mean, we are very lucky. We're all very lucky. We work in an industry that even when we have slow economies, we have a recession, and we have a bunch of companies, mass layoffs of thousands of people, there's still thousands and thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of jobs on job boards for every other company. We're just redistributing engineering right now. That's all we're doing. Facebook, all these other companies that are letting people go, Google, those people are just going to go work somewhere else. And then those companies will finally have some good people. Instead of what's happening today is that person with no skills, or I would say very few skills in DevOps, can get a job in DevOps. When, I've watched, in just the last 2 years, I've watched multiple companies always have to settle and to hire someone that doesn't have the skills they needed because they can't find that person. So they have to hire someone who's underqualified, who has potential, but they're underqualified. And that doesn't happen en masse at giant scales that we're talking about with the millions and millions of engineers all around the world. That doesn't suddenly go away because of a new tool or a new advancement. I mean, even AI can't do this job as fast as we're seeing it happen. We're going to have a giant leap in AI. Like it's going to have to evolve 20 years in a year for anything to be displaced, in my opinion. I am not an expert on economics, by the way, so you probably shouldn't be asking me those questions. But no, I'm not scared at all. It's hard for people to find the perfect job. It's hard to find the perfect boss. But we have more opportunity in our careers than a lot of other careers, right? A lot of other people aren't as lucky as we are. So I'm not scared. Just keep learning. Always keep learning. Never stop. You're here learning now. So you're doing the right thing. You're doing all the right stuff. Can you integrate a Copilot with shells? As far as I know, no, you can't. What I do see is some companies experiment, or some tools experimenting with shell-based access to ChatGPT over the API, but it's really slow because it has to go back, and ChatGPT is super slow because everybody's using it. The only thing I know that Copilot can do is be in an editor, and it does support other editors. It now supports Vim, as well as a few other IDEs. So, and it doesn't do anything in the shell itself. Ooh, Conrad's saying it will be the voice for Copilot. That's cool. I'm looking forward to that. You got a link? You got something you can share? I'm excited about whatever GitHub's doing. So they make great stuff. So. Well, so if it's a trick question, I'm not going to answer it. So I'm not even going to read this one. If your master keys for any system like that need to be stored in a secure system outside of that system, whatever you consider that to be secure. 1Password, a cloud vault, a physical safe, wherever you think you want to store your master keys. So that's up to you, and that is very team and person specific. You're always going to have master keys. You're going to, the root certificate to a Kubernetes cluster is in the cluster. The root account on your AWS has access to everything in that AWS account, right? So sometimes teams will take that password for that account and they'll store it in a physical safe, or they'll store it in 1Password and only the CEO has access, or whatever. It just completely depends upon your security posture, your opinions, what you consider safe and not safe. It's a trick question, but there is no real answer that everybody follows. I would love I would love my computer to respond to Hey GitHub. I'm not sure if I need another device listening for my voice, but I absolutely would talk. And today that actually exists. Like I'm on a Mac, and you can hit a microphone button on your Mac and type into VS Code today. It just works on a Mac with a single button on your keyboard. So I can do voice input, and then technically Copilot will generate stuff based upon my input on a comment. So I write comments and then it does that stuff. So technically we're getting close. But the problem is with Copilot is that it can't go outside of that file. So I can't tell it to do a bunch of things at the command line. It's not an AI for my whole computer. It's just in the editor. It's just in that editor, so. I'm surprised no one helped Alexander, but are there any Kubernetes compatible orchestrator system alternatives? No, because then that would be Kubernetes. As far as I know, we don't have another system that is the Kubernetes API, because that would be the Kubernetes API. I mean, they would just be using the same API, and it's a big API. So, no. No, I think you could look at the infrastructure architecture of K3S and how it's a single binary versus a traditional Kubernetes cluster, like RKE from Rancher, same company, right? And you could look at that and say architecturally and infrastructurally, keys or K3S is very different because it's a single binary. It's all in one. It's not all these different components. Like if you install micro K8s, that has some things as system level services in systemd, some other things that you might consider control plane in containers. And so it crosses boundaries and updates different things different ways. And architecturally, as an infrastructure person, that's very different from K3s. But they're both the same API, right? I don't know anyone who's writing, the Kubernetes API, which is Golang, in Rust, because they'd have to rewrite the whole thing in Rust. And that's a lot of code generated over 7 years. It's a lot of code. So I don't know anyone that's doing that. And I don't know why they would ever do that, since it's open source and, it's an interesting question, but I don't actually know of anyone that's ever attempted that. Newton's asking, what do you think about platform engineering movement, news approaches, and tooling like dynamic configuration management, IDP? I think the platform engineering is just an evolution of the same thing we've all been doing. I don't think it's a new paradigm shift, and I certainly don't think it deserves the hype. There, I said it. Platform engineering is really just what DevOps has been doing for the longest time. It's just a different word for it. Operations teams that are implementing SRE practices are doing the platform engineering. We're just defining the word a different way, in my opinion. These are all the same people doing all the same work. And really, to me, it's a branding opportunity for companies. That's all it really is. We don't, the companies, and I know you know who they are, the company that says DevOps is dead, it's bullshit. It's marketing garbage that makes us think that we need their thing over some other thing. So what I would say is the ideas around a team that is creating infrastructure and deployments as a service, which is not new, that idea is where Kubernetes lives. That's where Docker lives. That's where DevOps lives. And those are things that we've been doing now for a decade or more. I mean, I was doing this stuff in well over a decade. And so I think platform engineering is just the latest term, kind of like, we had cloud native, we have all these new terms that are really just redefining old ideas. It's a trendy term, but I don't think it changes anything. All these tools are all moving to the same places. We're all getting more automated. I've been working on teams 7 years ago. I was working on a team before that word was ever even heard. I was working on a team that was doing exactly those things with old tools, pre-Docker. We were building websites for people. Hell, I was doing this in 2008 on Hyper-V. We were allowing developers to go to a website that was made by Microsoft. It was a tool that allowed them to create VMs and give them access to easily copy their applications to and run them without any sysadmin having to be involved in the provisioning process, right? So we were, in a sense, doing all the things that we talk about today with stuff like dynamic provisioning, platform engineering. These are not new things. It's just branding, I think, for a lot of tooling that wants to try to own the space. And I think self-service, which is what we always have been calling it, self-service is the idea that someone can automate their job so that other people who couldn't previously do it can do some of the work that would require them to be there to do. Whether that's VM provisioning. That's why the cloud was invented. The cloud is a platform, and it was invented because we were all waiting on people. Cool. My wife just let me know we got 76 people waiting on that course, by the way. So if you want to get on the course, news break, want to get on the course, there's a waiting list for our Maven course. So it's launching in March. You're going to be spending an hour and a half every other day with me for 2 weeks. And you're going to learn GitOps and how to deploy automatically to Kubernetes. Automation is one of the core principles of self-service. And so tying this back to your great question, Newton, this is not me being me. I'm trying to reduce the hype for you. I appreciate the question because there's a lot of hype in that, and I can understand your confusion and concern. Maybe you really like the ideas, and you want to move in that direction, but they're not new, and we've been doing it for a very long time. I think things like projects that are creating it easier for DevOps people, operations people, and developers to automate their job and to give it to others, and us turning that into tools is a great idea. So I'm glad all these things exist, but I hate for us to all pretend that it's new or it's suddenly something that wasn't possible before. Because, over 15 years ago, I was creating monitoring dashboards in complete open source free tooling for Windows and Linux from open source stuff that allowed people to create their own graphs, to monitor their own stuff, and then send them, at the time it was email alerts because we didn't have Slack, email alerts when things they cared about happened in the infrastructure. We allowed people to provision VMs for their own use on different sizes and different parts of the data center. This was before Amazon. This is before the cloud. Microsoft was doing this a long time ago. All the other companies were doing it too. And then the cloud came around, which was another form of platform engineering that allowed shadow IT, as we called it. It was the idea of the shadows of people that didn't have traditional access to the data center to go and provision systems on their own in a web interface that didn't require touching hardware. That was a great idea in 2007 when AWS invented it. And they were really just spinning up the things that everyone else was already doing before them. Other hosters were doing that. Bluehost. I was using Bluehost 20 years ago to auto-provision me websites. So this is all just iterations on the same ideas, but what we're doing now, I think that's better than before, is we're making it expectations of larger teams. That's what I do really like about the new messaging, is that we don't want to guilt people into this. We don't want to make people think that they're doing it wrong if they're not platform engineering. But what we want to do is help people understand that you're not valuable because you're the only one that can do it. You're actually less valuable when you're the only one that can do it, because now you're a risk. We need to allow you the tools and the methods to take what you know, turn it into a recipe, and let other people run that recipe. And we've been doing that for decades and decades. We're just got a new name for it. So that's a great topic. I should probably have a whole conversation, a whole show about breaking down what platform engineering is and reducing the hype, because it's not new and you can do it without buying new stuff. You can do it with the tools you have today. GitLab or GitHub? I'm GitHub all the way. I have never... I don't know. I'm never caught on to the GitLab. I don't dislike the GitLab. It's just not for me. I like GitHub Actions. I like GitHub Code Spaces. I love Code Spaces. I love Copilot. I love all the stuff that GitHub's doing. GitLab is great, and I know a lot of people that are huge fans of it. So if you have a choice, if you just go GitHub, it's where everyone's at. The thing about GitHub is that even if you go GitLab, you can't avoid GitHub. But you're still going to have to be on GitHub. All your open source is going to live there that you're going to get and use, your Docker, your Kubernetes, all your other stuff. And then 1% is on GitLab. So I think you go GitLab after you've learned GitHub, you know GitHub, and you've tried GitLab, and it speaks to you. Maybe you like something about it. You like the way that its interface works. You like the self-hosted free nature of it. Maybe you really like that, to self-host. I am not someone who likes to self-host because I'm way too busy, and my teams, everyone I work with, engineers, DevOps people, they're all super busy. They don't have time to run another server that they have to maintain and keep it up. That's why we like software as a service, SaaSes. We like things on the internet. But I also love open source, and I respect privacy. So if you're someone who's worried about privacy, you want to run it yourself, you want to put it in your closet, GitLab is great. Git is also something that I hear a lot about lately. So Wow, thank you so much. We've got a super sticker. So the heap, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the donation. I'm 2.5 hours into this COVID laden chat, which is not a record. I've done over 8 hours before nonstop streaming. DockerCon 2020. You can go back into DockerCon 2020 and see me live stream nonstop all day for DockerCon rather. That was my record. But in case you didn't know, at the beginning, I have COVID. I'm in the middle of COVID. I'm surviving. Luckily, I have the boosters, the bivalent boosters, so I'm not that sick. It's actually for COVID, it's been pretty easy. Just got to get a lot of rest. But if you go back to DockerCon 2020 on YouTube, let's see if I can find it. I found it somewhere. Oh, you know what? It's on my Find My. Yeah, switch the tab. So I don't know if James knows this, but in 2020, before COVID was a thing, before we even knew COVID was happening, Docker was planning their first virtual DockerCon. They had just split the company and they were only 70 employees, so they didn't have the staff anymore to run a huge multi-million-dollar event. So they were planning a live stream, and I was helping them in December and January before COVID lockdowns happened, and we were planning on actually having all the speakers go to San Francisco, but the attendees would be virtual, and we were going to do a live studio set like the news, and we had all these plans, all these green screens. It was going to be awesome. It was going to be epic. And what came out of it was I hosted let's see, how long is this stream? How long is this stream? 7 hours and 26 minutes. So it wasn't quite 8 hours. Technically, right after this was over, we did an hour-long Zoom. So it was a Zoom after this. So 8.5 hours of being live on a video to people. So if you haven't had the chance to see the insanity of what it's like to talk for 8 hours straight, I did get breaks, but it was streaming from my computer to the internet. With all these people and more. We had a bunch of special guests. We had probably triple that amount of people all show up, and people kept coming on and leaving. It was epic. It took months of planning. It will probably be, in my history, it will probably be one of the biggest events I've ever done. I even did all these intro special effects where oh, go away, ad. Hide. We had all these intros. We did, let's see. We did this crazy stuff. This is kind of a blast from the past. I was actually looking at it recently. We did, these are all intros I made using Final Cut Pro and a bunch of other 3D tools. But we took all the pictures from... We took the pictures from previous physical DockerCons, put them all into this thing. I found some 3D effects on the internet I could do this with. It's cool that the chat's still there because you can still see the people in the chat from 3 years ago. But yeah, we did this 7-hour stream. My wife sat next to me, and basically she was pushing all the buttons from the stream decks, and we had separate displays that were watching the live stream output while I was watching. It was a lot of fun. It was very complicated. It will probably never happen again because Docker now kind of does it themselves. But I had Laura Nermal, some of my best friends, on the show, other Docker captains, and we just went on, and every time we broke, we had other people. We did silly things like we sent everyone green screens and special webcams that were better than, because nobody had webcams back then. They all were using their crappy laptop ones. We actually had Scott Hanselman on the show of Microsoft fame. He's one of my heroes on the internet. He's one of the best techers out there in terms of And yeah, I mean, we had designers creating a design set. All this stuff is happening, and it was going through Skype, and it was crazy. Anyway, that's a blast from the past. But this stream has been pretty long, so we're going to wrap it up. All right, let me scan through all of this to make sure I got most of these questions answered. Sorry if I didn't get to all your questions. Again, we're doing these more often. I'm doing these every other week now, is one style of this virtual chat, Q&A, live stream, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, there's some chat here. I'm missing a lot of it. All right, sorry if I'm missing some of your stuff. I'm sad that I can't answer every question. I'm losing my voice. That's an easy question to answer. Is that the "this is fine" meme? Yes. Over here, that is the actual official art from the author. It is not me stealing someone else's work. I actually paid him. You can go and look for the shop. He has his own shop. I'm unfortunately forgetting the gentleman's name right now. But he has his own shop. And you can buy that, and you can actually have him sign it. I did not have him sign it, I don't think, but we had it framed professionally. And yes, this is fine, because that's kind of how we operate. NSX, thank you so much for the appreciation. An apt-get update. Upgrades to 23. Oh wow, that is aggressive. I agree. That's pretty crazy. But they got to get it out there at some point. They've been going through releases for a while now, alpha and beta releases. Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, I've not been pinning either, because it's just been fixes after fixes after fixes. That's a great point. That is something that we're all going to have to start doing, because we may have problems with V23. There's a lot there. As you can imagine, 3 years of changes all in one. So how can you manage your learning more efficiently? I wish I had time, Jackson. That's a great question. Hard to juggle all the DevOps related tooling out there and what to learn next. I have FOMO, and I have all the things, all the fear of missing outs, the imposter syndrome. Look that up if you don't know what that is. I have that. I don't consider myself the world's smartest DevOps person. I always wish I had more experience in this or more knowledge about that. Or I have a never-ending list of articles that I don't read. And so I feel like I have a lot of learning on how to learn as well. I just consume content as much as I can, and I don't retain as much as I wish I could. What I've learned is that it's okay for me to forgive myself, but to forget what I've learned. So two things, I guess I'm going to give you tips, and then we're going to try to wrap this up. Hey, thank you so much, Martin, for the super chat. For the super chat. All right, let me get this super sticker out there. It doesn't show me that. I can't get that tweet. Oh, celebrates 1 month as a member. Oh, is that what it is? Nice. Thanks so much for being a member. By the way, you can be membership here to support this show and support what I'm doing, the podcast, the open source, all of it. You can support it here by getting membership here or on my website. You also get exclusive benefits on our Discord server, over 12,000 DevOps people. But I appreciate all of you for being here. But this is a great question, I think, to wrap up with, because I think we're all struggling with this. Let me get back to this question. Jackson is asking around learning all the new things. So I think YouTube continues to play a major, major role in my learning. I try to read as much as I can off of Kubernetes.io on their blog. I use Pocket from Mozilla, and I pay for Pocket because I believe in paying when you can for open source, especially. But Mozilla Foundation, they're a nonprofit, and one of the few ways I can thank them for Firefox and everything else is by paying for Pocket. So I pay for Pocket to store and help me catalog and read all the things on the internet. So you can see over here, this is Pocket, getpocket.com. I store things I need to read there. I am not one. There's now a million ways you can catalog and capture bookmarks, reading list in Safari, reading list in Chrome. What I like is a dedicated app for storing the things I want to read later from any website, and it will sync them offline on every one of my devices so that I always have access to it. And so that's how I read long-form content. Every blog post from Kubernetes.io tends to go in there. Most blog posts from Docker.com go into there. And then from there, obviously we have Substack now. Substack has a great there's probably people watching right now that have their own Substack for newsletters. So here's my recommendation, 2 things. I've learned that I forget a lot more nowadays, especially as I get older. I don't seem to retain as well as I used to decades ago when I was younger. So I put a lot of notes on things I'm doing in Notion. I use Notion. Notion is the tool that I use. Well, it's not that one. I want Notion, the website, but Notion.so. Go check that out. It's a note tracking app. I left Evernote years ago for that. So what I do is I try every day to be putting stuff about what I'm doing into Notion, because I tend to forget what I did. I forget. I was just yesterday building my new workshop for Civo Navigate. I'm going to do a Docker 101 workshop. It's called Docker 101 in 2023. So it's a workshop I've done a lot of years, for probably 7 years now, 8 years. I've only got 85 minutes to do it, and it's for people that maybe need a refresher on Docker or people that are new to Docker. Well, I have tons of notes everywhere, and it turns out all those notes are outdated. I have thousands of slides that I help Jerome Pedizzoni, thank you, Jerome, keep up to date on container.training. If you've never been to that website, container.training, completely open source training on Docker and Kubernetes, delivered by me, Jerome, a lot of other people over the years. It's at least 7 or 8 years old, something like that. And I'm building the servers that we're going to do. Well, guess what? I had forgotten a lot of that stuff. I just did it less than a year ago, and I've already forgot. So I realized that my notes in Notion were not sufficient. And so now I'm in Notion again this week, rewriting my notes in a way that will help me the next time remember to do it. And the more I do that, the better off I am. I suck at remembering the thing I did 6 months ago and how I did it. I forget things I deployed 3 months ago and how I did it. So I've learned to store as much as I do in Notion. I track everything in there but secrets. I put my scripts in there, my commands. I don't literally put everything, but things that I know I will need again. And even then, I still don't think I put enough in there. So that's 1. So Pocket is 1, Notion is 2, and just use other people. So I have a newsletter. Get it below for free. Substack is the place for newsletters. I am not on Substack because I'm tired of these platforms screwing me over. I just got kicked off Review because Twitter shut down Review. I lost all my back catalog of newsletters. So I'm not doing that anymore. I'm tired of newsletter systems either raising their prices or going away or shifting focus to something I don't like or having their own politics or whatever. So I'm now running my newsletter on my website so I can control it. I've been doing newslettering and blogging for 2 decades or more. I'm tired of changing. So Substack is a great thing for finding your friends and the people you know and following them in newsletters. So what I've tended to do over the years is, instead of doing an RSS feed, we all remember RSS? It's still a thing. But 15 years ago, I would use Google Groups, or not Google Groups, but Google Reader, and I would read everyone's blogs. What I do now is I don't have time for that, and there's so much out there. I would have to read 1,000 blogs, right? Every CNCF project. So what I do is I read the newsletters of other people smarter than me. The Chris Short newsletter over on DevOps-ish, right? A great newsletter where he summarizes his view of the landscape, all that stuff. Go check him out, and go find those newsletters out there. I don't really keep track of a lot of these newsletters, and mostly because Substack is now doing that for us. If you go sign in to Substack, and I think if you like connect it to Twitter or something, I'm not sure exactly how it works, but oh yay, Cloudflare. But on Substack, you can find the newsletters where a lot of people are writing them, and I'm now on like 5 or 6 different Kubernetes and cloud native newsletters. I don't read them all, but what I do is I scan them, looking for things of interest that I need now. And what I think is one of the most critical skills in cloud native, and for any of us watching today, is not just how you learn and that you have a methodology for learning, but that you're able to have your own system, whether that's bookmarks or Notion or Evernote or wherever you want to track all this stuff. You have a way to find that thing you remembered you heard about 3 months ago. Because a lot of our job is we get a new problem, we have to come up with a solution. We don't remember how to solve that solution because we've never maybe had to solve it, or we haven't solved it in years. But we do remember learning about something that's related to that. We can have a vague memory of, and then we need a system to go find what that was, right? Imagine in your brain if you had the CNCF landscape. If you had this in your brain, every time someone says, what is that tool to protect Kubernetes resources and clusters from using the latest images? I don't want to use latest. I only want to use versioned images. You got to pin your images. What's that tool that somebody mentioned on Bret's podcast? Well, that's technically in here, but you're not going to be able to find it because you can't really search that way, at least not yet. We don't have a methodology for asking it a chat GPT question and it determining the answer. But I do keep track of all these things I hear about in Notion, and I try to put in words to search on, security, policy, Kubernetes. And so over the years, I used to use bookmarks in my browser as my primary way of knowing if I knew about that thing or to find those things. And I had categories and folders and subfolders that doesn't scale well for me. So I'm starting to move, and it's a continual effort because I have thousands and thousands of bookmarks, but I started to move that into Notion. So when I learn about something, I make a random new thing. I have a dumping area in my Notion note-taking tool. I have an area that I'm allowed to just dump I call it digital brain. It's just dump anything I thought about, anything I learned, and I hope that search can find it. So that's the other thing. So I give you three or four things there. Use Pocket for things you want to read. Use Notion to track everything you're doing, have done, and will do. And hope that the search will help you find it, which is not always perfect, but it's something. And then instead of following all of the things, obviously podcasts, there's tons of these podcasts. I have a podcast. There's the official Google Kubernetes podcast or whatever. Tons of podcasts out there. But I can never remember the tools they mentioned or the stuff they mentioned, so I have to have somewhere for that. And what I do for that is I also use my email. I have all those newsletters from Substack and all the other ones all dumping into my email. So when I need to find something I can't remember and I don't even know where to start searching, I typically go to Notion. I can search Notion, I can search Pocket, and I can I can search my bookmarks because they're kind of old at this point. And I can search my email, which has all those newsletters. And I actually set up rules in my email so that all newsletters coming in are tagged as a newsletter so that when I search for something like Kubernetes 125 release or whatever, or Kubernetes image pull back off, because we mentioned that, we talked about that today. Then I will search the three of those and see before I just search Google sometimes, I will search those because I don't even know what I would look for in Google. And Google, I don't know about you, but Google's getting worse for me, not better. So it's harder and harder for me to find genuine information that I'm looking for in Google. And
sorry, I don't understand.
Siri's over there talking to me. All right. Travis, by the way, you're going to be the last one I thank. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being a member, Travis. I appreciate you for being here. And the rest of you, thank you so much. My voice is about to go, so I'm going to finally get off, almost 3 hours in. And thank you for all the tips. James is throwing stuff in there. I need to dash. All right, thanks so much, James. Martin, thanks for the tips. Bookstack, that's great. And thanks for all your questions. Again, I'm trying to do these now every other week. We're doing lives every week. We're going to rotate between guests and new tools and doing these Q&As and me showing off the stuff I'm working on. And we're going to do that more often to answer your questions. So if you didn't get your question answered, go over there, the devops.fan. That's our Discord server. That's where we hang out. That's where we chat all week long and ask your questions there. There are plenty of smart people there that know things that I do not know. So it's great to ask a community and not just one person. I'm just one small person in this large community. So check it out on Discord if you like Discord. Obviously, we're all on Twitter. Go check me out on Twitter. And I'll be back here from Florida at Civo Navigate next Thursday. And we're going to be talking networking. Next week on the show, let me just bring up my notes because I didn't prepare for that. Next week on the show, we are going to have Project Calico. We're going to have Thomas from Tigera, and we're going to be talking about networking plugins for Kubernetes, specifically the Calico project. We've talked about other ones before. This time we're going to be talking all about the Calico, and what you can do with their advanced networking plugins for Kubernetes and beyond. So come back and join us next Thursday. I'll see you soon here on the live show. Ciao, and thanks so much for being here. See you next week.